The 7th century witnessed a profound transformation in the political landscape of the Frankish kingdoms, as the once mighty Merovingian dynasty gradually surrendered effective governance to an ambitious aristocratic family that would ultimately reshape European history. The Merovingian kings, descendants of Clovis I, who had unified much of Gaul under Frankish rule in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, found their authority systematically eroded by a combination of internal strife, territorial fragmentation, and the rise of powerful noble houses that commanded both military resources and administrative expertise. The Merovingian decline manifested most visibly in the phenomenon of the roi fainéants, or do-nothing kings, rulers who retained the ceremonial trappings of kingship while real power shifted to the mayors of the palace. These officials, originally household administrators responsible for managing royal estates and coordinating court functions, evolved into de facto rulers who controlled taxation, military campaigns, and diplomatic relations. The transformation occurred gradually, beginning in the mid-7th century when weak Merovingian succession crises created power vacuums that ambitious mayors eagerly filled. The Arnulfing Pipinid family emerged from this political chaos as the dominant force, tracing their lineage through two interconnected noble houses. The Arnulfings derived their name from Arnulf of Metz, a 7th century bishop and nobleman whose son Ansegisel married Bega, daughter of Pepin III of Landen. This union created the Pipinid line, which would produce the most successful mayors of the palace. Pepin I, known as Pepin the Elder, had already established the family's political credentials by serving as mayor in Austrasia, the Eastern Frankish kingdom, where he skillfully navigated court intrigues and built networks of loyal supporters among the Austrasian nobility. The family's rise coincided with the increasing political fragmentation of the Frankish realm. Following the death of Dagobert in 639, the last truly powerful Merovingian king, the Frankish territories split into three primary kingdoms: Austrasia in the east, Neustria in the west, and Burgundy in the southeast. Each kingdom maintained its own mayor of the palace, creating a complex web of rivalries and alliances that the Pipinids learned to exploit with remarkable skill. The Austrasian nobility, composed largely of Germanic warrior aristocrats who valued military prowess and personal loyalty, proved particularly receptive to Pipinid leadership. Pepin II of Herstal, grandson of Pepin the Elder, consolidated the family's position through a series of calculated political maneuvers and military campaigns. His victory at the Battle of Tertry in 687 marked a crucial turning point, as he defeated the Neustrian mayor Berchar and effectively unified the mayoralties of Austrasia and Neustria under his control. This triumph demonstrated the Pipinids' ability to project military power beyond their Austrasian base, while establishing their dominance over rival aristocratic factions. Pepin II's administration revealed sophisticated understanding of Frankish political dynamics, as he maintained the fiction of Merovingian royal authority while systematically concentrating real power in his own hands. The death of Pepin II in 714 precipitated a succession crisis that nearly destroyed Pipinid hegemony. His legitimate heir, Grimoald, had predeceased him, leaving the mayoralty contested between Pepin's widow Plectrude, who sought to preserve power for her young grandsons, and Charles, Pepin's illegitimate son by his concubine Alpaida. The Neustrian nobility, sensing weakness, revolted under the leadership of Ragenfrid, while Frisian and Saxon tribes launched raids into Frankish territory. Charles, initially imprisoned by Plectrude to prevent his interference, escaped and began gathering supporters among the Austrasian warriors who remembered his father's military successes. Charles Martel, as he became known, demonstrated exceptional military and political acumen in his struggle for control. The epithet Martel, meaning hammer, reflected his devastating effectiveness in battle and his relentless pursuit of enemies. His early campaigns against Ragenfrid and the Neustrian rebels showcased tactical innovations, that would define Carolingian military doctrine for generations. At the Battle of Amblève in 716, Charles employed coordinated cavalry charges and disciplined infantry formations to rout a numerically superior Neustrian-Frisian coalition, establishing his reputation as a formidable battlefield commander. The consolidation of Charles Martel's power required more than military victories. It demanded sophisticated political engineering that transformed the relationship between the Frankish aristocracy and central authority. Charles understood that the traditional Germanic warrior bands that had served earlier Frankish rulers were insufficient for the complex challenges facing 8th century Francia. Instead, he developed a system of land grants that provided mounted warriors with the economic resources necessary to maintain expensive military equipment while ensuring their personal loyalty to the Carolingian house. These benefices typically consisted of confiscated church lands or estates seized from defeated enemies, redistributed to followers who swore oaths of personal fidelity to Charles. The recipients, known as vassi or vassals, received not only land but also the agricultural surplus generated by peasant labour, enabling them to purchase horses, weapons, and armour required for heavy cavalry service. This arrangement created a new military aristocracy bound to the Carolingians through personal obligation rather than tribal or territorial loyalty, fundamentally altering the structure of Frankish society. Charles Martel's most celebrated military achievement came in 732 at the Battle of Tours, also known as the Battle of Poitiers, where his forces confronted a major Umayyad raiding expedition that had penetrated deep into Frankish territory. The Muslim forces, led by Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, had crossed the Pyrenees and advanced northward through Aquitaine, capturing Bordeaux and threatening the wealthy monasteries and towns of central Francia. Duke Odo of Aquitaine, initially defeated by the Muslim advance, appealed to Charles for assistance, recognizing that only the Frankish mayor possessed sufficient military resources to halt the invasion. The confrontation near Tours represented more than a simple clash between Christian and Muslim forces. It embodied the collision of two distinct military traditions and political systems. The Umayyad army consisted primarily of light cavalry armed with composite bows and curved sabres, tactics perfected through decades of conquest across North Africa and Iberia. These mounted archers excelled in mobility and harassment, using hit-and-run attacks to disrupt enemy formations before delivering decisive charges. The Muslim force also included significant numbers of Berber warriors and Iberian converts, creating a diverse but experienced military machine. Charles Martel's army reflected the evolving nature of Frankish warfare, combining traditional Germanic infantry with increasing numbers of heavy cavalry. The Frankish foot soldiers, armed with long spears, battle axes and round shields, formed the backbone of Charles's formation. These warriors, many of whom had served in previous campaigns against Saxon and Frisian enemies, possessed exceptional discipline and cohesion. The mounted contingent, though smaller than in later Carolingian armies, included the mayor's personal retainers and noble followers equipped with long swords, lances and mail hauberks. The battle itself unfolded over several days of skirmishing before the decisive engagement. Charles positioned his forces on elevated ground between Tours and Poitiers, using the terrain to negate the Muslim cavalry's mobility advantage. Contemporary accounts describe the Frankish formation as resembling a wall of ice, with infantry ranks so tightly packed that enemy charges could not break through. When Abd al-Rahman launched his main assault, the Frankish line absorbed the impact and gradually pushed forward, their heavy weapons and superior armour proving decisive in close combat. The death of Abd al-Rahman during the fighting demoralised the Muslim forces, leading to their withdrawal southward across the Pyrenees. While some modern historians question whether the battle truly saved Christian Europe from Muslim conquest, its immediate impact on Charles Martel's political position was undeniable. The victory enhanced his reputation throughout Francia and beyond, attracting new followers and demonstrating the effectiveness of his military reforms. Papal correspondence from the period reveals growing recognition of Charles as the de facto ruler of the Franks, despite his continued maintenance of Merovingian figureheads. The aftermath of Tours accelerated Charles Martel's transformation of Frankish political structures. The confiscation of additional church lands to reward his followers expanded the benefice system, creating a larger pool of mounted warriors dependent on Carolingian favour. This policy generated tension with ecclesiastical authorities, who protested the seizure of monastic properties, but Charles prioritised military effectiveness over clerical concerns. His pragmatic approach to governance reflected understanding that political survival required continuous adaptation to changing circumstances. Charles's later campaigns against the Saxons, Frisians and Alemanni further consolidated Carolingian dominance, while extending Frankish influence into previously independent territories. These expeditions combined military conquest with systematic efforts to establish administrative control and promote Christian conversion. The integration of conquered populations into the Frankish system required careful balance between coercion and accommodation, as Charles sought to transform potential enemies into loyal subjects. The mayor's relationship with the Catholic Church evolved significantly during his reign, moving from initial suspicion to grudging cooperation and eventual alliance. While Charles continued to appropriate ecclesiastical lands for military purposes, he also supported missionary activities in frontier regions and maintained correspondence with papal authorities. This pragmatic approach laid groundwork for the closer church-state cooperation that would characterize later Carolingian rule. When Charles Martel died in 741, he bequeathed to his sons Pepin III and Carloman a transformed political landscape in which the Carolingian family exercised effective control over most Frankish territories. The division of authority between the brothers initially threatened renewed civil conflict, but their cooperation in facing external threats and managing internal administration demonstrated the institutionalization of Carolingian power. Carloman's unexpected retirement to monastic life in 747 left Pepin as sole mayor, setting the stage for the final transformation from de facto to de jure royal authority. Pepin III, known as Pepin the Short due to his modest physical stature, possessed political acumen that matched his military capabilities. Unlike his father, who had been content to rule through Merovingian puppets, Pepin recognised that the fiction of royal legitimacy had outlived its usefulness. The last Merovingian kings exercised no real authority and commanded little respect from either the nobility or common people. Pepin's decision to claim the royal title himself represented a calculated risk that required careful preparation and powerful allies. The mayor's approach to this revolutionary transformation revealed sophisticated understanding of the religious and political currents shaping 8th century Europe. Rather than simply deposing the Merovingian king through force, Pepin sought legitimization from the highest ecclesiastical authority in Western Christianity. His correspondence with Pope Zacharias in 750 posed a carefully crafted question: who should be king, the person who exercises royal power, or the one who merely holds the title? The papal response, endorsing the principle that effective authority should be formally recognized, provided the religious sanction Pepin required for his coup. The deposition of Childeric III in 751 marked the end of Merovingian rule and the beginning of the Carolingian dynasty. The ceremony itself combined traditional Frankish elements with Christian ritual, as Pepin received both the acclamation of assembled nobles and anointing with holy oil. This religious consecration, performed by Bishop Boniface with papal authorization, invested Carolingian kingship with sacred character that transcended mere political authority. The anointing ceremony established precedent for the divine right of kings that would influence European monarchical ideology for centuries. The papal alliance that legitimized Pepin's usurpation also created obligations that would shape Carolingian policy for generations. Pope Stephen II's journey to Francia in 754 to personally anoint Pepin and his sons demonstrated the Church's commitment to the new dynasty while securing Frankish military support against Lombard threats to papal territories in Italy. This mutual dependence between Carolingian rulers and papal authority would prove central to the expansion of Frankish power and the spread of Christian civilization throughout medieval Europe. Pepin III's death in September 768 at Saint-Denis precipitated a succession arrangement that would test the stability of the nascent Carolingian dynasty. Following Frankish tradition, the kingdom was divided between his two sons, Charles, who received Austrasia, Western Aquitaine, and the northern territories including Neustria, while his younger brother Carloman I inherited Burgundy, Provence, Septimania, Eastern Aquitaine, and Alemannia. This partition created an awkward geographical division, with Carloman's territories forming a crescent that nearly encircled Charles's domains, leaving both brothers dependent on each other's cooperation for effective governance and military campaigns. The joint kingship began under inauspicious circumstances, as the brothers' relationship quickly deteriorated into mutual suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Charles, 26 years old at his accession, possessed the imposing physical presence that would become legendary, standing nearly 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. With broad shoulders, a thick neck, and the commanding bearing of a natural warrior king. Contemporary accounts describe his piercing blue eyes and carefully maintained moustache, physical attributes that reinforced his authority among the Frankish nobility, who valued martial prowess above all other royal qualities. Carloman, 3 years younger than his brother, demonstrated equal intelligence but lacked Charles's charismatic presence and instinctive understanding of Frankish political dynamics. The younger brother's territories, while geographically compact, contained restive populations including recently conquered Lombard allies and semi-independent Aquitanian nobles who had never fully accepted Carolingian authority. These administrative challenges, combined with Carloman's more cautious temperament, created fundamental differences in how the brothers approached governance and military policy. The first major crisis of the joint reign emerged in 769, when Hunald II, son of the former Duke of Aquitaine, launched a rebellion aimed at restoring Aquitanian independence. Hunald had fled to Lombard territory following his father's earlier defeat by Pepin III, but King Desiderius of the Lombards provided him with military support and encouraged his return to challenge Carolingian rule. The rebellion quickly gained momentum among Gascon nobles and Basque chieftains, who resented Frankish taxation and the imposition of Christian religious practices on their traditional pagan customs. Charles immediately recognised the threat posed by Hunald's uprising and requested military assistance from Carloman, expecting the joint response that Frankish tradition and political necessity demanded. However, Carloman refused to commit his forces to the campaign, claiming that his territories faced their own security challenges and that Charles possessed sufficient resources to handle the Aquitanian rebellion independently. This refusal represented more than mere sibling rivalry. It reflected Carloman's calculation that weakening Charles through a difficult campaign would enhance his own position within the divided kingdom. The Aquitanian campaign of 769 showcased Charles's emerging military genius and his ability to adapt Carolingian tactical innovations to diverse terrain and enemy forces. The Gascon and Basque warriors employed guerrilla tactics learned through centuries of resistance to Roman, Visigothic and Frankish invasions, using their intimate knowledge of the Pyrenean foothills and river valleys to launch sudden attacks before melting away into the mountainous landscape. These fighters, armed with javelins, short swords and small round shields, possessed exceptional mobility and endurance that allowed them to strike Frankish supply lines and isolated detachments. Charles responded by dividing his army into multiple columns that could move independently while maintaining communication through mounted messengers. This tactical flexibility prevented the concentration of Frankish forces into a single vulnerable target, while enabling coordinated operations across the rebellious territories. The king personally led the main column, consisting of his heavy cavalry and veteran infantry, while trusted commanders directed supporting formations that swept through Gascon strongholds and Basque villages. The decisive engagement occurred near the fortress of Fronsac, where Huneld had concentrated his remaining followers in preparation for a final stand. Charles's forces approached the stronghold through a series of coordinated movements that sealed off escape routes while positioning siege equipment within range of the walls. The Frankish army included specialised engineers who had perfected techniques for reducing fortified positions, using massive catapults and battering rams constructed from local timber under the protection of mobile wooden shields. The siege demonstrated Charles's understanding that medieval warfare required more than battlefield prowess. Successful campaigns demanded logistical planning, engineering expertise, and the ability to sustain military operations over extended periods. The Frankish baggage train included not only weapons and armour, but also portable forges for maintaining equipment, medical supplies for treating wounded warriors, and sufficient provisions to maintain army morale during lengthy operations. This organisational sophistication distinguished Carolingian military forces from the improvised war bands that had characterised earlier Germanic warfare. Hunold's surrender after a brief siege effectively ended organised Aquitanian resistance, but Charles recognised that lasting control required more than military victory. The king implemented a comprehensive pacification programme that combined selective punishment of rebel leaders with generous treatment of nobles who submitted voluntarily. Gascon and Basque chieftains, who acknowledged Carolingian authority, retained their local positions while accepting Frankish oversight and Christian missionary activities within their territories. The successful conclusion of the Aquitanian campaign enhanced Charles's reputation throughout Francia, while highlighting Carloman's political isolation. The younger brother's refusal to support the expedition had alienated many nobles who viewed such cooperation as fundamental to Carolingian unity, while Charles's clemency toward defeated enemies demonstrated the political wisdom that would characterise his later imperial administration. The campaign also provided Charles with valuable experience in managing diverse populations and integrating conquered territories into the expanding Frankish realm. Carloman's unexpected death in December 771 at Samoussy fundamentally altered the political landscape of the Carolingian kingdom. The younger brother, who had shown increasing signs of illness during the preceding months, died without making clear provisions for succession, leaving his widow Gerberga and young sons Pepin and Syagrius as potential claimants to his territories. Frankish law and tradition supported the principle of inheritance through male lineage, but the children's minority created uncertainty about guardianship arrangements and actual governance of Carloman's domains. Charles moved swiftly to consolidate control over his brother's former territories, demonstrating the decisive leadership that would define his reign. Rather than acknowledging his nephew's inheritance rights or negotiating with Gerberga supporters, the king claimed direct authority over all Carolingian lands based on his position as senior male member of the dynasty. This bold assertion challenged established succession practices but reflected Charles's understanding that divided authority would weaken the kingdom against external threats and internal rebellions. The consolidation process required careful management of noble loyalties and regional power structures that had developed during Carloman's 3-year reign. Many Burgundian and Alemannian aristocrats had established personal relationships with the deceased king and might resist absorption into Charles's expanded domain. The new ruler addressed these concerns through a combination of personal diplomacy, strategic marriages among noble families, and confirmation of existing land grants and privileges that maintained local elite interests. Gerberga's flight to Lombard territory with her children created a potential focus for future challenges to Charles's authority, but the immediate threat remained manageable due to the young prince's minority and lack of established power bases within Francia. King Desiderius of the Lombards welcomed the refugees as potential tools for pressuring Charles, but the Lombard ruler's own territorial ambitions in central Italy limited his ability to support Carolingian pretenders effectively. The unification of the Carolingian kingdom under Charles's sole authority eliminated the geographical awkwardness of the previous partition, while concentrating military and administrative resources under single command. This consolidation proved crucial for the ambitious campaigns that would define the remainder of Charles's reign, as unified Frankish territories could support larger armies and more sustained military operations than the divided kingdom had permitted. Charles's attention soon turned to the deteriorating situation in Italy, where Lombard expansion threatened papal territories and challenged the alliance that had legitimized Carolingian rule. King Desiderius had systematically violated agreements with previous popes by occupying cities claimed by the papal patrimony, while his support for Carloman's widow and children represented direct interference in Frankish internal affairs. The Lombard ruler's actions created both moral obligations and strategic opportunities that Charles could not ignore without undermining his dynasty's credibility. Pope Hadrian's appeals for Frankish intervention against Lombard aggression provided Charles with religious justification for military action, while advancing Carolingian territorial ambitions in northern Italy. The papal letters described Desiderius's occupation of Ravenna, Imola and other cities as violations of sacred agreements that threatened the independence of the Roman Church. These appeals resonated with Frankish nobles who viewed their kingdom as the primary defender of Catholic Christianity against pagan and heretical enemies. The decision to invade Lombard territory represented a significant escalation of Carolingian military commitments, requiring logistical preparations far more complex than previous campaigns within Frankish borders. Italian operations demanded crossing the Alpine passes with sufficient forces to confront the Lombard army while maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain. Charles's planning for this expedition revealed the sophisticated administrative capabilities that distinguished his reign from earlier Frankish military adventures. The Frankish army that assembled for the Italian campaign in 773 reflected the military innovations that had evolved since Charles Martel's time. The corps consisted of heavily armoured cavalry equipped with long lances, broadswords, and mail hauberks that provided protection against Lombard weapons. These mounted warriors, drawn from the benefice-holding aristocracy, possessed both the equipment and training necessary for sustained combat operations far from their home territories. The infantry component included veteran warriors armed with Francisca throwing axes, long spears, and round wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses. These foot soldiers, many of whom had served in previous Aquitanian and Saxon campaigns, provided the disciplined ranks necessary for siege operations and mountain warfare where cavalry effectiveness was limited. The army also included specialised units of crossbowmen, engineers and siege specialists, whose skills would prove essential for reducing Lombard fortifications. Charles divided his forces into two main columns for the Alpine crossing, with one army advancing through the Mont Cenis Pass, while another moved through the Great St. Bernard Pass. This strategy prevented the Lombards from concentrating their defensive efforts at a single location, while ensuring that Frankish forces could converge on the Po Valley from multiple directions. The king personally commanded the larger column, maintaining direct control over the most critical phase of the campaign. The Lombard response to the Frankish invasion revealed the limitations of Desiderius's military position, despite his kingdom's apparent strength. The Lombard army, while numerous and fighting on familiar terrain, lacked the organisational cohesion and tactical flexibility that characterised Carolingian forces. Lombard warriors retained many characteristics of traditional Germanic warbands, with personal loyalty to individual commanders taking precedence over unified command structures. Desiderius attempted to block the Frankish advance at the Chius di San Michele, a narrow defile that commanded the approach to the Po Valley. The Lombard king positioned his main force to defend this natural bottleneck while deploying smaller detachments to watch other potential crossing points. However, Charles's two-pronged advance strategy negated this defensive advantage by forcing the Lombards to divide their attention between multiple threats. The breakthrough at Cius de San Michele occurred when Frankish forces advancing through the Great St. Bernard Pass outflanked the main Lombard position, threatening Desiderius's communications with his capital at Pavia. The Lombard king, faced with encirclement, ordered a general withdrawal that quickly degenerated into a rout as disciplined units dissolved under pressure from pursuing Frankish cavalry. The collapse of organised Lombard resistance opened the Po Valley to Carolingian occupation and marked the effective end of independent Lombard power in northern Italy. Charles's siege of Pavia during the winter of 774 demonstrated the logistical capabilities that enabled Carolingian forces to sustain operations far from their home bases. The Frankish army established permanent camps around the Lombard capital, constructing earthworks and wooden palisades that protected the besiegers while preventing supplies from reaching the defenders. The siege required constant vigilance and systematic reduction of the city's defences through coordinated attacks on walls and gates. The successful conclusion of the Lombard campaign with Desiderius's surrender in June 774 marked Charles's assumption of the title King of the Lombards, adding Italian territories to his expanding realm. This acquisition represented more than mere territorial expansion. It established Carolingian authority over the wealthy cities and fertile plains of northern Italy, while securing papal territories from future Lombard threats. The integration of Lombard administrative structures and noble families into the Carolingian system required careful diplomatic management that would influence Charles's later imperial policies. The Saxon Wars, beginning in 772 and continuing intermittently until 804, represented the longest and most challenging military commitment of Charles's reign. The Saxon tribes occupying the territories between the Rhine and Elbe rivers had maintained their independence through centuries of Roman and Frankish expansion, preserving pagan religious practices and tribal political structures that resisted integration into Christian kingdoms. These Germanic peoples, divided into four main tribal groups, the Westphalians, Ingrians, Eastphalians and Nordalbingians, shared common cultural traditions while maintaining separate political organisations under their own chieftains and assemblies. Saxon military capabilities posed significant challenges for Carolingian forces accustomed to fighting organised kingdoms with centralised command structures. Saxon warriors employed guerrilla tactics that exploited their intimate knowledge of local terrain, launching sudden attacks on Frankish settlements and supply lines before disappearing into dense forests and marshlands. These fighters, armed with spears, battle axes, and small round shields, possessed exceptional mobility and endurance that allowed them to avoid decisive battles while inflicting steady casualties on occupying forces. The religious dimension of the Saxon conflict added ideological intensity that distinguished these campaigns from purely political or territorial wars. Saxon paganism, centred on worship of Woden, Donar, and other Germanic deities, represented a direct challenge to Christian civilization that Charles viewed as fundamental to Carolingian identity. The destruction of the Irminsul, a sacred pillar that symbolised Saxon religious beliefs, during the 772 campaign demonstrated Charles's determination to eradicate pagan practices alongside political resistance. The systematic conversion campaigns and brutal suppression of Saxon rebellions throughout the 780s and 790s had established Charles as the dominant Christian ruler in Western Europe. But the events leading to his imperial coronation emerged from a complex web of Roman politics, papal vulnerability, and Byzantine weakness that created unprecedented opportunities for Carolingian expansion of authority. Pope Leo III's election in 795 following Hadrianus's death brought to the papal throne a man of humble origins whose legitimacy faced immediate challenges from the Roman aristocracy, particularly the nephews of his predecessor who viewed the new pope as an usurper of their family's ecclesiastical patrimony. The Roman nobility's opposition to Leo III reflected deeper tensions within the papal administration, where competing factions had long struggled for control over the vast landed estates, administrative appointments, and diplomatic relationships that constituted the temporal power of the papacy. The Hadrian family faction, led by Paschal and Campulus, possessed extensive connections among Roman clergy and maintained correspondence with Frankish court officials who had worked closely with the previous pope during the Lombard campaigns. These aristocratic opponents accused Leo III of personal misconduct, financial irregularities, and canonical violations that they claimed invalidated his papal authority. The crisis erupted on April 25, 799, during the Greater Litany's procession from the Lateran to San Lorenzo in Lucina, when armed supporters of Paschal and Campulus attacked the papal entourage near the monastery of St. Stephen and Sylvester. The assailants dragged Leo III from his horse, stripped him of his papal vestments, and attempted to blind him and cut out his tongue, punishments that would have rendered him canonically unfit for ecclesiastical office according to contemporary church law. Contemporary accounts describe the Pope's narrow escape from permanent mutilation, though whether his injuries were as severe as initially reported remains disputed among modern historians. Leo III's flight to Charlemagne's court at Paderborn represented more than a desperate appeal for protection. It constituted a deliberate political strategy that would fundamentally alter the relationship between papal authority and Carolingian power. The Pope's journey through the Alps with a small retinue of loyal supporters demonstrated his understanding that only Frankish military intervention could restore his position in Rome while simultaneously providing Charles with unprecedented leverage over papal policy. The meeting between Pope and King at Paderborn in the summer of 799 established the framework for the imperial coronation that would occur 18 months later. Charles's response to the papal crisis revealed the sophisticated political calculations that characterized his mature reign. Rather than immediately dispatching military forces to restore Leo III, the king appointed a commission of Frankish nobles and clergy to investigate the charges against the Pope, while providing him with honourable sanctuary at the Carolingian court. This measured approach allowed Charles to evaluate the political implications of intervention while demonstrating his role as protector of the Roman Church without appearing to act precipitously or without proper deliberation. The Commission's findings, predictably, supported Leo III's innocence of the charges brought against him, but the investigation process had served Charles's purposes by establishing Frankish authority to adjudicate papal disputes and creating precedents for future intervention in Roman affairs. The king's eventual decision to escort Leo III back to Rome with a substantial military force in late 800 represented both a restoration of papal authority and an assertion of Carolingian supremacy over the temporal aspects of papal governance. The circumstances surrounding Charles's arrival in Rome on November 24th, 800, created an atmosphere of expectation and uncertainty that would culminate in the imperial coronation 5 weeks later. The Frankish army's presence in the city intimidated Leo III's opponents while providing the Pope with the security necessary to reassert his authority over Roman administration. Charles established his residence at the Vatican, symbolically positioning himself as the protector of St. Peter's Shrine, while conducting the formal proceedings that would clear Leo III of all charges against him. The synod convened at St. Peter's on December 1st, 800, represented a careful orchestration of canonical procedures that legitimised both papal authority and Carolingian intervention. Leo III's oath of innocence, sworn before an assembly of Frankish and Roman clergy, followed established ecclesiastical precedents while acknowledging the king's role as the ultimate guarantor of church order. The proceedings demonstrated Charles's understanding of the legal and religious formalities necessary to establish lasting political arrangements while avoiding the appearance of arbitrary exercise of power. The coronation ceremony on Christmas Day 800 occurred within this context of restored papal authority and demonstrated Carolingian supremacy, though the precise sequence of events and the degree of advanced planning remained subjects of historical debate. Contemporary accounts, particularly the Liber Pontificalis and the Royal Frankish Annals, provide conflicting details about whether Charles anticipated the coronation or was surprised by Leo III's actions during the Christmas Mass. The weight of evidence suggests that while the specific timing and ceremonial details may have been arranged by the Pope, the general concept of imperial coronation had been discussed between Charles and his advisors as a logical culmination of his territorial conquests and religious authority. The ceremony itself combined Christian religious ritual with deliberate evocation of Roman imperial precedents, creating a new form of legitimacy that transcended both Germanic kingship traditions and Byzantine imperial claims. Leo III's placement of a golden crown on Charles's head, while the assembled Roman populace acclaimed him as Augustus, established visual and auditory parallels with ancient imperial inaugurations, while investing the new title with specifically Christian significance through its performance during the most sacred celebration of the church calendar. The immediate political implications of the imperial coronation reverberated throughout the diplomatic relationships that connected the Carolingian realm with neighbouring powers, particularly the Byzantine Empire, which had maintained theoretical claims to universal imperial authority since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. The Byzantine Emperor Irene's reaction to news of Charles's coronation revealed the profound challenge that Carolingian imperial pretensions posed to established concepts of political legitimacy and territorial sovereignty in medieval Europe. The Byzantine court's initial response combined outraged rejection of Carolingian imperial claims with pragmatic recognition that military confrontation across the vast distances separating Constantinople from Aachen remained impractical given existing logistical constraints and competing strategic priorities. Irene's correspondence with Charles through diplomatic intermediaries reflected the complex calculations that governed Byzantine foreign policy, as the emperor sought to maintain theoretical supremacy while acknowledging practical limitations on her ability to enforce imperial prerogatives in Western Europe. The diplomatic exchanges between the Carolingian and Byzantine courts during the years immediately following the coronation established patterns of communication and negotiation that would influence medieval international relations for centuries. Charles's ambassadors to Constantinople, carefully selected from among his most educated and diplomatically experienced advisors, carried credentials that asserted full imperial equality while proposing practical arrangements for territorial boundaries and commercial relationships that acknowledged existing spheres of influence. The theological dimensions of the imperial coronation extended far beyond immediate political considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority that would shape medieval political theory. The concept of translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial authority from east to west, provided ideological justification for Carolingian claims while establishing precedents for the later development of the Holy Roman Empire as a distinct political entity with its own constitutional traditions and institutional structures. Leo III's role in the coronation ceremony invested the papal office with unprecedented authority to create and legitimize imperial power, establishing principles that would influence church-state relations throughout the medieval period. The Pope's action implied that legitimate imperial authority derived from Christian consecration rather than military conquest or hereditary succession, creating theological foundations for papal claims to supremacy over temporal rulers that would generate centuries of conflict between emperors and popes. The administrative challenges posed by governing an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Albera River and from the North Sea to central Italy required institutional innovations that extended far beyond the personal loyalty relationships that had characterized earlier Frankish governance. Charles's response to these challenges resulted in the creation of the Missi Dominici system, a network of royal commissioners who travelled throughout the empire to supervise local administration, investigate complaints against regional officials, and ensure compliance with imperial legislation. The Missi Dominici typically operated in pairs, with one ecclesiastical and one lay commissioner sharing responsibility for specific territorial circuits that encompassed multiple counties or duchies. This arrangement provided checks and balances that prevented individual commissioners from accumulating excessive local influence, while ensuring that both secular and religious perspectives informed imperial oversight of regional governance. The commissioners possessed authority to hear legal appeals, review financial accounts, and remove incompetent or corrupt local officials, creating direct connections between imperial policy and local implementation that bypassed traditional noble intermediaries. The selection criteria for Missi Dominici reflected Charles's understanding that effective imperial administration required individuals who combined personal loyalty to the emperor with technical competence in law, finance, and military affairs. The commissioners were typically drawn from the palace clergy, court officials, and trusted members of the imperial nobility who possessed both the education necessary to understand complex legal and administrative issues and the social status required to command respect from regional aristocrats and ecclesiastical hierarchies. The capitularies issued to guide the activities of the Missi Dominici provide detailed insights into the scope and complexity of Carolingian imperial administration. These legislative documents address subjects ranging from standardization of weights and measures to regulation of monastic discipline, from military service obligations to procedures for conducting local courts. The comprehensive nature of these instructions demonstrated Charles's ambition to create uniform administrative standards throughout his diverse territories while respecting local customs and legal traditions that had developed over centuries of independent or semi-independent governance. The implementation of the Missi Dominici system required extensive logistical support that strained the resources of the imperial administration, while demonstrating the organisational capabilities that distinguish Carolingian governance from earlier medieval political structures. The commissioners required transportation, lodging and security during their travels, expenses that were typically borne by local communities through established obligations for supporting royal officials. The system also demanded extensive record-keeping to track the activities of individual commissioners and ensure coordination between different circuits. The territorial organisation of the Missi Dominici circuits reflected careful consideration of geographical, cultural and political factors that influenced the effectiveness of imperial oversight. The boundaries of individual circuits typically followed natural features such as rivers or mountain ranges, while respecting established ecclesiastical provinces and traditional tribal territories that retained significance for local populations. This arrangement facilitated communication and travel while minimizing conflicts between imperial administration and existing power structures. The legal authority exercised by the Missi Dominici encompassed both secular and ecclesiastical jurisdictions, creating unprecedented integration of temporal and spiritual governance under imperial oversight. The commissioners possessed authority to review decisions made by local courts, investigate charges of judicial corruption or incompetence, and ensure that ecclesiastical institutions complied with canonical regulations and imperial legislation. This comprehensive jurisdiction reflected Charles's conception of imperial responsibility for maintaining justice and order throughout all aspects of society. The relationship between the Missi Dominici and established regional authorities required delicate negotiation of competing claims to jurisdiction and authority that reflected broader tensions within the imperial system. Dukes, counts and bishops who had previously exercised largely autonomous authority within their territories found their decisions subject to review and potential reversal by imperial commissioners who answered directly to the emperor. The successful implementation of this system required diplomatic skill from the commissioners and grudging acceptance from regional elites who recognized the benefits of imperial protection and support. The financial implications of the Missi Dominici system created additional pressures on imperial resources that were already strained by continuous military campaigns and extensive building projects throughout the empire. The commissioners' salaries, travel expenses, and administrative costs represented significant expenditures that required careful budgeting and efficient tax collection from territories that varied enormously in their economic productivity and administrative capacity. The system's sustainability depended on maintaining the delicate balance between imperial oversight and local autonomy that preserved regional cooperation, while ensuring compliance with imperial policy. The educational requirements for effective operation of the Missi Dominici system accelerated the development of palace schools and scriptoria that would become centres of the Carolingian Renaissance. The commissioners needed literacy in Latin, familiarity with legal procedures, and understanding of theological principles that governed ecclesiastical administration. The palace school at Aachen, under the direction of Alcuin of York and other scholarly luminaries, provided training for future commissioners while preserving and copying the classical and patristic texts that informed Carolingian legal and administrative practices. The establishment of the palace school at Aachen represented Charles's recognition that effective imperial governance required a literate administrative class capable of managing the complex legal, diplomatic, and ecclesiastical affairs of his vast territories. The school's foundation around 782 coincided with the emperor's growing awareness that the Frankish nobility's traditional emphasis on military prowess, while essential for conquest and defence, proved insufficient for the sophisticated administrative challenges posed by governing diverse populations from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The recruitment of scholars from across Europe to staff this educational institution reflected both the international scope of Carolingian ambitions and the relative scarcity of learned men within the Frankish heartlands. Alcuin of York emerged as the most influential figure in this scholarly recruitment campaign, arriving at the Carolingian court in 781 after establishing his reputation as master of the cathedral school at York, one of the most prestigious centres of learning in Anglo-Saxon England. Alcuin's educational background encompassed the full range of classical learning that had been preserved in Irish and English monasteries during the preceding centuries of continental upheaval, including a mastery of Latin grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the 7 liberal arts that formed the foundation of medieval education. His personal library, which he brought to Aachen, contained copies of works by Virgil, Cicero, Livy, and other classical authors alongside patristic texts by Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory the Great. The Yorkshireman's pedagogical methods reflected the sophisticated educational traditions that had developed in Northumbrian monasteries under the influence of scholars like Bede the Venerable and Benedict Biscop. Alcuin emphasized the systematic study of grammar as the foundation for all learning, requiring students to master the complexities of Latin syntax and vocabulary before advancing to more specialized subjects. His textbook dialogues, written in question and answer format, provided structured approaches to learning that could be adapted for students of varying abilities and backgrounds. The master's correspondence reveals his understanding that effective education required patient repetition and gradual progression from simple concepts to complex theoretical frameworks. Einhard's arrival at the palace school around 796 brought different but complementary skills to the Carolingian educational enterprise. The young Frankish nobleman, educated at the monastery of Fulda under the direction of Abbot Sturm, possessed exceptional talents in mathematics, architecture, and engineering that proved invaluable for Charles's extensive building projects throughout the empire. Einhard's small physical stature, which earned him the nickname Nodulus among his contemporaries, belied his intellectual capabilities and his eventual emergence as the emperor's most trusted advisor on matters requiring technical expertise and precise calculation. The future biographer's educational philosophy differed markedly from Alcuin's emphasis on classical literary studies, focusing instead on practical applications of learning that could serve immediate imperial needs. Einhard's mathematical treatises provided instruction in surveying techniques, architectural proportions, and engineering principles that enabled the construction of bridges, fortifications, and monumental buildings throughout Carolingian territories. His approach to education reflected the pragmatic orientation that characterized much of the Carolingian Renaissance, where scholarly activity served political and administrative purposes rather than purely intellectual pursuits. Paul the Deacon's recruitment to the Palace School in 782 added crucial expertise in historical scholarship and poetic composition that enhanced the court's cultural prestige while serving important propaganda functions for the Carolingian dynasty. The Lombard monk's background at the monastery of Monte Cassino had provided him with access to extensive manuscript collections that preserved classical historical works, alongside contemporary chronicles of Lombard and Byzantine affairs. His Historia Langobardorum, completed before his arrival at Aachen, demonstrated sophisticated narrative techniques and critical evaluation of sources that established new standards for medieval historical writing. The Lombard scholar's position at court required careful navigation of potentially conflicting loyalties, as his presence served both to demonstrate Carolingian magnanimity toward defeated enemies and to provide expertise in Italian affairs that proved essential for governing the recently conquered territories. Paul's correspondence reveals his efforts to maintain relationships with former colleagues in Lombard monasteries, while demonstrating unwavering loyalty to his new Carolingian patrons. His poetic compositions celebrating Charles's military victories and imperial dignity provided models for court literature that influenced subsequent generations of Carolingian writers. The curriculum developed by these scholars for the Palace School reflected their diverse backgrounds and expertise while serving the specific needs of imperial administration. The elementary program emphasized Latin literacy through intensive study of grammar, vocabulary, and syntax, using classical texts selected for their moral content and stylistic excellence. Students progressed through carefully graded readings of Christian poets like Prudentius and Sedulius, before advancing to prose works by church fathers and classical historians. The advanced curriculum included instruction in law, theology, mathematics, and natural philosophy that prepared graduates for careers in imperial service or ecclesiastical administration. The school's physical facilities at Aachen occupied specially constructed buildings within the palace complex that provided appropriate settings for scholarly activities while demonstrating imperial support for learning. The main classroom featured raised platforms for instructors, writing desks for students, and storage areas for manuscripts and writing materials. Adjacent rooms housed the growing library collection and scriptoria where students copied texts under the supervision of experienced scribes. The proximity of these educational facilities to the imperial residence symbolized the integration of scholarship into the highest levels of Carolingian governance. The standardization of liturgical practices throughout the Carolingian Empire represented one of the most ambitious and successful aspects of the cultural revival, requiring coordination between imperial administration and ecclesiastical hierarchies across territories with diverse religious traditions and local customs. The project's origins lay in Charles's recognition that uniform religious observances would strengthen imperial unity while demonstrating Carolingian commitment to Orthodox Catholic Christianity. The emperor's correspondence with Pope Hadrian I during the 780s established the framework for liturgical reform that would transform religious life throughout Western Europe. The adoption of Roman liturgical practices as the standard for all Carolingian territories required systematic collection and distribution of authoritative texts that could serve as models for local churches and monasteries. Imperial agents travelled to Rome to obtain authentic copies of sacramentaries, lectionaries, and other liturgical books that embodied papal traditions developed over centuries of Christian worship. These manuscripts, carefully copied by palace scribes, served as exemplars for further reproduction in scriptoria throughout the empire, creating networks of textual transmission that ensured accuracy and consistency in liturgical reform implementation. The Gregorian sacramentary, obtained from Pope Hadrian I around 785, became the foundation for standardized mass celebrations throughout Carolingian territories, though its adaptation to Frankish conditions required extensive supplementation and modification. The original Roman text, designed for papal liturgies in the city's ancient basilicas, lacked many prayers and ceremonies required for ordinary parish churches and monastic communities. Alcuin's revision of the sacramentary, completed around 800, added necessary materials while preserving the essential structure and theological content of Roman traditions. This editorial work established precedents for liturgical development that influenced Catholic worship for centuries. The promotion of the Vulgate Bible as the standard scriptural text for all Carolingian churches represented a massive undertaking that required comparison of numerous manuscript traditions to establish accurate readings of biblical texts. The project's complexity arose from centuries of scribal errors, regional variations, and deliberate modifications that had corrupted the original translation completed by Jerome in the late 4th century. Alcuin's team of scholars spent years collating manuscripts from libraries throughout Europe to produce corrected versions that restored Jerome's original work while eliminating accumulated textual corruptions. The Biblical Revision Project's methodology reflected sophisticated understanding of textual criticism that anticipated modern scholarly techniques by several centuries. The Carolingian scholars systematically compared readings from multiple manuscript families, evaluated variant texts based on their geographical distribution and antiquity, and applied grammatical and theological criteria to determine authentic readings. The work produced standardized biblical texts that served as the foundation for medieval theology and biblical scholarship, while demonstrating the intellectual rigor that characterized the best Carolingian scholarship. The development of Carolingian minuscule script emerged from practical needs for clear, efficient writing that could facilitate the massive copying projects required for liturgical and educational reform. The new script combined elements from various regional writing traditions, including Roman cursive, insular majuscule, and Merovingian scripts, to create a standardized form of writing that balanced legibility with speed of execution. The script's development occurred gradually during the late 8th and early 9th centuries as scribes in various scriptoria experimented with letter forms and spacing that would optimize readability while minimizing the time required for copying lengthy texts. The technical innovations embodied in Carolingian minuscule included consistent letter heights, standardized spacing between words, and systematic use of punctuation marks that clarified textual meaning for readers. The script's lowercase letters featured simplified forms that eliminated the elaborate flourishes and connecting strokes that had characterized earlier medieval writing, reducing the likelihood of copying errors while accelerating the production of manuscripts. The adoption of this standardized script throughout Carolingian territories facilitated communication between different regions, while ensuring that texts copied in one location could be easily read in another. The widespread adoption of Carolingian minuscule required extensive training programs for scribes working in monasteries, cathedral schools, and palace scriptoria throughout the empire. Master scribes travelled between institutions to demonstrate proper letter forms and writing techniques, while exemplar manuscripts provided models that local scribes could imitate in their own copying work. The standardization process extended beyond mere letter forms to include conventions for abbreviations, capitalization, and page layout that created visual consistency across the expanding corpus of Carolingian manuscripts. The script's influence extended far beyond the Carolingian period, as its clear, readable forms provided the foundation for later medieval writing traditions and ultimately influenced the development of modern printed typefaces. Renaissance humanists, seeking to revive classical learning, adopted Carolingian minuscule as their preferred script because they mistakenly believed it represented ancient Roman writing rather than a medieval innovation. This historical irony ensured that Carolingian scribal innovations would continue to influence European literary culture long after the political structures that created them had disappeared. The monastic reform movements that flourished under Carolingian patronage represented systematic efforts to restore religious communities to their original spiritual purposes while integrating them into imperial administrative and cultural programs. The reforms addressed widespread problems of monastic discipline that had developed during the preceding centuries of political instability, when many religious houses had become secularized institutions that served primarily as sources of income for noble families, rather than centers of prayer and learning. Charles's legislation regarding monastic life, embodied in numerous capitularies issued between 789 and 813, established comprehensive standards for religious observance that applied to all monasteries within imperial territories. The rule of St. Benedict's adoption as the standard for Carolingian monasticism reflected both its practical wisdom in organizing religious communities and its compatibility with imperial goals for religious reform. Benedict's 6th century rule provided detailed instructions for monastic governance, daily schedules of prayer and work, and procedures for maintaining discipline that had proven effective in numerous Italian monasteries. The rule's emphasis on stability, obedience, and conversion of life aligned with Carolingian efforts to create ordered religious communities that could serve as centers of learning and cultural preservation, while supporting imperial policies through prayer and scholarship. The implementation of Benedictine standards throughout Carolingian territories required extensive consultation between imperial administrators and monastic leaders who understood the practical challenges of religious reform. Abbot Benedict of Aniana emerged as the primary architect of this reform movement, drawing on his experience in founding and governing monasteries to develop comprehensive programs for implementing the rule of St. Benedict in diverse institutional contexts. His Concordia Regularum, completed around 817, provided systematic comparison of various monastic rules that demonstrated Benedict's superiority, while offering practical guidance for communities transitioning to Benedictine observance. The architectural achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance reflected both the empire's material prosperity and its cultural ambitions to revive the grandeur of classical Roman civilization while adapting ancient forms to contemporary Christian purposes. The Palatine Chapel at Aachen, begun around 792 and consecrated in 805, represented the most ambitious and successful of these architectural projects, combining Byzantine, Roman and Germanic design elements to create a structure that embodied Carolingian imperial ideology while serving practical needs for court ceremonies and religious observances. The chapel's octagonal design derived from Byzantine models, particularly the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, which Charles had visited during his Italian campaigns and admired for its innovative use of space and light. The Carolingian architects adapted this Eastern prototype to accommodate Western liturgical practices, while incorporating decorative elements that proclaimed imperial authority and Christian devotion. The building's two-story elevation created separate spaces for the emperor and his court in the upper gallery, while providing areas for clergy and congregation on the ground level. The construction techniques employed at Aachen demonstrated remarkable revival of classical Roman engineering skills that had been largely forgotten in Western Europe during the preceding centuries. The builders used sophisticated methods for creating the chapel's complex vaulting system, employing precisely cut stone blocks and innovative centering techniques that enabled construction of the ambitious dome structure. The project required importation of materials from throughout the empire including marble columns from Italy, bronze railings from local workshops, and decorative mosaics created by craftsmen trained in Byzantine techniques. The death of Charlemagne on January 28, 814, at the age of 71, marked the end of an era that had witnessed the transformation of a Frankish kingdom into a vast Christian empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Elbe River. His son Louis, who had been crowned co-emperor 3 years earlier, inherited not merely territories and titles, but the immense challenge of maintaining unity among diverse populations, competing noble factions, and ecclesiastical hierarchies that had been held together primarily by his father's commanding presence and military prowess. Louis the Pious, as he became known, possessed neither Charlemagne's imposing physical stature nor his instinctive understanding of the delicate balance between force and diplomacy that had characterized imperial governance for over a decade. The new emperor's personality reflected the profound influence of ecclesiastical education and monastic ideals that had shaped his upbringing in Aquitaine, where he had served as sub-king since 781. Unlike his father, whose approach to Christianity remained pragmatic and politically oriented, Louis demonstrated genuine piety and theological sophistication that earned him respect among church leaders, while creating expectations for moral leadership that would prove difficult to maintain. His tall, lean frame and ascetic habits contrasted sharply with Charlemagne's robust appetite for food, drink, and physical pleasures, symbolizing a generational shift towards more austere imperial conduct that reflected contemporary religious reform movements. The initial years of Louis's reign witnessed ambitious attempts to strengthen imperial administration through comprehensive legal reforms and ecclesiastical reorganization that extended his father's cultural and religious policies. The emperor's collaboration with Benedict of Aniane in promoting monastic reform demonstrated his commitment to creating a more thoroughly Christian empire, while his support for educational initiatives and scriptural scholarship continued the Carolingian Renaissance's emphasis on learning and cultural preservation. These early successes created optimism among contemporaries that the empire would continue to flourish under pious and learned leadership. However, the fundamental structural problems inherent in Carolingian governance soon became apparent as Louis struggled to balance competing demands from regional aristocracies, ecclesiastical hierarchies, and his own family members who expected significant roles in imperial administration. The empire's vast extent made effective central control increasingly difficult, while the absence of standardized administrative procedures and reliable communication systems created opportunities for local autonomy that undermined imperial authority. The emperor's attempts to address these challenges through increased reliance on ecclesiastical advisors and moral exhortation proved inadequate for managing the complex political and military realities of early 9th century Europe. The Ordinatio Imperiae, promulgated in July 817 at the Assembly of Aachen, represented Louis's most significant attempt to resolve the succession problems that had plagued Frankish kingdoms for centuries while preserving imperial unity under centralized authority. The document established a detailed plan for dividing administrative responsibilities among Louis's 3 sons, while maintaining the theoretical supremacy of the eldest, Lothair, who would inherit the imperial title and direct authority over the empire's most important territories. This arrangement reflected contemporary understanding of imperial dignity as indivisible while acknowledging practical necessities for regional governance that required delegation of authority to trusted family members. Under the terms of the Ordinatio Imperiae, Lothair received designation as co-emperor with rights of succession to the imperial crown, direct control over Italy and the central Frankish territories, and supervisory authority over his younger brother's kingdoms. Pepin received the kingdom of Aquitaine, which he had already been governing since 814, along with expanded territories in southern Francia that reflected the region's strategic importance for controlling communications with Spain and the Mediterranean. Louis the German obtained the eastern territories beyond the Rhine, including Bavaria, Alemannia, and the Saxon Marches, regions that required strong military leadership to defend against Slavic and Magyar incursions. The succession plans attempt to balance imperial unity with practical governance requirements created inherent contradictions that would generate decades of civil conflict. While Lothair's imperial authority theoretically encompassed the entire Carolingian realm, his younger brother's kingdoms possessed sufficient resources and administrative autonomy to function as independent political entities. The arrangement required unprecedented cooperation among royal siblings who controlled competing power bases and faced different strategic challenges in their respective territories. The success of this system depended on personal relationships and voluntary compliance rather than institutional mechanisms that could enforce imperial supremacy. The birth of Charles the Bald in 823 to Louis's second wife, Judith of Bavaria, fundamentally disrupted the carefully constructed succession arrangements established by the Ordinatio Imperii. Judith, daughter of the powerful Bavarian Duke Welf, brought to the imperial court extensive family connections and political ambitions that conflicted with the interests of Louis's older sons from his first marriage. Her influence over the aging emperor, combined with her determination to secure territorial provisions for her infant son, created factional divisions within the imperial court that undermined the stability of the succession plan. The empress's background reflected the complex ethnic and political dynamics that characterized Carolingian aristocratic society. The Welf family had established its prominence through marriage alliances and military service that connected Bavarian regional interests with broader imperial policies, while their extensive landholdings provided economic resources that enabled independent political action. Judith's education, unusual for women of her era, included literacy in Latin and familiarity with legal procedures that enabled her to participate effectively in court deliberations and correspondence with ecclesiastical and secular leaders throughout the empire. The political crisis precipitated by Charles the Bald's birth intensified as Louis began making territorial concessions to accommodate his youngest son's future inheritance. The emperor's decision to grant Charles significant portions of Alemannia and other territories previously assigned to his older brothers violated the principles established by the Ordinatio Imperii, while demonstrating the continuing influence of Frankish inheritance customs that required provisions for all legitimate male heirs. These modifications created uncertainty about the succession plan's permanence, while encouraging Louis's older sons to view their father's arrangements as subject to arbitrary revision. The first major rebellion against Louis's authority erupted in 830 when Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German formed a coalition aimed at deposing their father and implementing the original terms of the Ordinatio Imperii without modifications for Charles the Bald. The rebels justified their actions by claiming that Louis had fallen under the corrupting influence of Judith and her supporters, who had allegedly introduced immoral practices and political favoritism that undermined imperial dignity. This propaganda campaign reflected sophisticated understanding of contemporary religious and political discourse that emphasized the emperor's moral obligations and the nobility's right to resist tyrannical governance. The rebellion's initial success demonstrated the fragility of imperial authority when confronted by coordinated opposition from regional power bases. Louis's supporters, primarily drawn from the palace clergy and administrators who depended on imperial favour, lacked the military resources necessary to confront the combined forces of the three kingdoms. The emperor's capture at Compiègne in June 830 and his subsequent confinement at the monastery of Saint-Médard represented a dramatic reversal of fortune that shocked contemporaries and revealed the extent to which Carolingian political stability depended on personal loyalty rather than institutional structures. The deposition proceedings conducted against Louis at the Assembly of Compiègne employed ecclesiastical procedures that reflected the increasingly important role of religious authority in legitimizing political action. The assembled bishops, many of whom owed their appointments to imperial favour, found themselves in the difficult position of judging their patron while responding to pressure from his rebellious sons. The charges brought against Louis included neglect of imperial duties, favouritism toward unworthy advisers, and violation of sacred oaths, accusations that combine traditional Germanic concepts of royal obligations with Christian moral standards. However, the coalition's inability to maintain unity once they had achieved their immediate objective of deposing Louis revealed the fundamental weakness of their position. Lothaire's assumption of imperial authority alienated his brothers, who had expected greater autonomy in their respective kingdoms, while his harsh treatment of former imperial supporters created new enemies among the nobility and clergy. The rebels' lack of a coherent programme beyond removing Louis from power became apparent as competing ambitions and regional interests reasserted themselves within the coalition. The restoration of Louis the Pious in March 831 occurred with surprising rapidity, as former rebels recognised that their interests were better served by supporting the legitimate emperor than by accepting Lothaire's domination. The emperor's public penance at the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne in Metz, while humiliating, provided the religious reconciliation necessary to restore his authority while demonstrating his commitment to Christian principles of governance. This ceremony established precedents for imperial accountability to ecclesiastical authority that would influence medieval political theory for centuries. The period following Louis's restoration witnessed intensive efforts to rebuild imperial authority while addressing the underlying problems that had precipitated the rebellion. The emperor's attempts to strengthen central administration through increased reliance on loyal administrators and systematic oversight of regional governance reflected lessons learned during his brief deposition. However, these reforms failed to resolve the fundamental contradictions between imperial unity and regional autonomy that continued to generate political instability throughout the 830s. The second major crisis of Louis's reign emerged in 833 when his sons again rebelled, this time with the active support of Pope Gregory IV, who travelled north of the Alps to mediate the dispute but ultimately endorsed the rebels' position. The papal involvement reflected growing ecclesiastical concerns about imperial policies that appeared to favour secular interests over religious reform, while Gregory's presence provided the rebels with religious legitimacy that had been lacking in their previous attempt. The confrontation at the Field of Lies near Colmar in June 833 demonstrated the complete breakdown of imperial authority as Louis's supporters deserted en masse rather than fight against forces blessed by papal authority. The emperor's second deposition and confinement at the monastery of Saint-Médard occurred under circumstances that revealed the sophisticated propaganda techniques employed by his opponents. The rebels' coordination with ecclesiastical authorities enabled them to present their actions as necessary measures for protecting Christian civilization from corrupt imperial governance, while their control of key administrative centres prevented Louis from communicating with potential supporters. The systematic nature of this campaign reflected careful planning and extensive consultation among the conspirators. Lothaire's second attempt to exercise imperial authority proved even more disastrous than his first, as his brothers quickly recognised that cooperation with papal representatives did not guarantee their own autonomy within the imperial system. The new emperor's efforts to centralise authority under his direct control conflicted with regional interests that had motivated the original rebellion, while his harsh treatment of former imperial supporters created widespread resentment among the nobility and clergy. The coalition's rapid disintegration demonstrated that successful rebellion required not merely the removal of unpopular rulers, but also viable alternatives that could command broader support. The final restoration of Louis the Pious in March 834 occurred through a carefully orchestrated campaign that combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiations, designed to isolate Lothair from his supporters. The emperor's ability to regain power twice after deposition revealed both the resilience of legitimate authority and the fundamental weakness of coalitions based primarily on negative objectives rather than positive programs. Louis's third reign, lasting until his death in 840, witnessed continued efforts to strengthen imperial institutions while managing the competing ambitions of his sons. The civil wars of the 830s had profound consequences for imperial authority and administrative effectiveness that extended far beyond the immediate political conflicts. The repeated depositions and restorations demonstrated to regional elites that imperial power could be successfully challenged through coordinated action, encouraging local autonomy and resistance to central control. The involvement of ecclesiastical authorities in political disputes created precedents for papal intervention in secular affairs while undermining the religious foundations of imperial legitimacy. The conflicts also revealed the inadequacy of existing administrative structures for managing succession crises and regional rebellions. The Strasbourg Oaths of February 14th, 842, sworn by Louis the German and Charles the Bald in their alliance against Lothair, represented a crucial moment in European linguistic and political development that transcended their immediate strategic importance. The ceremony occurred at the Cathedral of Strasbourg before assembled armies of the two brothers who had recognized that their individual resources were insufficient to challenge Lothair's imperial authority effectively. The location's symbolic significance, situated at the intersection of Germanic and Romance linguistic territories, emphasized the cultural diversity that characterized the Carolingian Empire, while highlighting the political divisions that threatened its unity. The oath's most remarkable feature was their delivery in vernacular languages, rather than the Latin that had served as the exclusive medium for official Carolingian documents since the dynasty's rise to power. Louis the German swore his oath in a Romance dialect that Charles the Bald's followers could understand, while Charles reciprocated by speaking in a Germanic dialect comprehensible to Louis's warriors. This linguistic accommodation reflected practical necessities for communicating with armies composed of soldiers who possessed little or no knowledge of Latin, while simultaneously acknowledging the emergence of distinct regional identities that transcended traditional tribal or territorial boundaries. The Romance version of the oath, preserved in contemporary chronicles, provides invaluable evidence for the development of Old French from its Latin origins during the early medieval period. The text demonstrates sophisticated understanding of vernacular grammar and vocabulary that suggests extensive prior use of Romance dialects for administrative and legal purposes, despite the absence of written records documenting this development. The linguistic features preserved in the oath indicate that Romance vernaculars had already diverged significantly from Classical Latin, while retaining sufficient mutual intelligibility to serve as media for inter-regional communication. The Germanic version of the oath reveals similar patterns of linguistic development within the eastern territories of the Carolingian Empire, where various tribal dialects were gradually coalescing into what would eventually become Middle High German. The vocabulary and grammatical structures preserved in the text demonstrate the influence of administrative Latin on Germanic vernaculars, while maintaining distinctly Germanic syntactic patterns and phonetic characteristics. The oath's preservation in written form suggests that Germanic dialects had achieved sufficient standardization to serve official purposes, marking an important stage in the development of German literary culture. The political implications of the Strasbourg Oaths extended far beyond their immediate strategic objectives to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of political loyalty and cultural identity within the Carolingian Empire. The brothers' decision to communicate in vernacular languages rather than Latin represented implicit acknowledgement that effective political authority required accommodation of regional linguistic preferences rather than imposition of uniform cultural standards. This recognition marked a significant departure from Charlemagne's policies, which had emphasized Latin literacy and cultural uniformity as foundations for imperial unity. The oaths also established important precedents for contractual relationships between rulers that would influence the development of medieval political theory and diplomatic practice. The detailed terms of the alliance, including mutual defence obligations and territorial agreements, created binding legal commitments that transcended personal loyalty relationships, traditionally governing royal cooperation. The public nature of the ceremony, conducted before assembled armies and recorded by contemporary chroniclers, demonstrated understanding that political agreements required public witness and documentation to ensure their effectiveness and permanence. The military campaigns that followed the Strasbourg Oaths reveal the continuing strength of imperial resources under Lothaire's control, while demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated opposition by his brothers. The battles fought throughout 842 and early 843 showcased tactical innovations and strategic planning that reflected the military sophistication achieved by Carolingian armies during decades of continuous warfare. However, the conflicts also revealed the devastating impact of civil war on the empire's economic resources and administrative capabilities, as competing armies devastated agricultural regions and disrupted commercial networks that had flourished under unified imperial governance. The negotiations leading to the Treaty of Verdun began in earnest during the spring of 843, as military stalemate and economic exhaustion forced the three brothers to seek diplomatic resolution of their conflicts. The preliminary discussions, conducted through ecclesiastical intermediaries who retained credibility with all parties, addressed fundamental questions about territorial boundaries, administrative authority, and the future structure of Carolingian governance. The complexity of these negotiations reflected the empire's ethnic diversity, economic interdependence, and the practical difficulties of creating viable political units from territories that had been governed as a unified system for over 4 decades. The Treaty of Verdun, concluded in August 843, established the tripartite division of the Carolingian Empire that would shape European political development for centuries. The agreement created 3 distinct kingdoms while maintaining theoretical acknowledgement of imperial unity under Lothaire's continued use of the imperial title. However, the practical provisions of the treaty established precedents for territorial sovereignty and political independence that effectively ended unified Carolingian governance while creating the foundations for the later development of France, Germany, and Italy as separate political entities. Charles the Bald received West Francia, encompassing the territories west of the Scheldt, Meuse, Saône and Rhône rivers, including the crucial regions of Neustria, Burgundy and Aquitaine that formed the core of what would eventually become the Kingdom of France. This Western Kingdom possessed significant economic advantages, including fertile agricultural lands, important commercial centres, and relatively secure borders that facilitated internal development while minimizing external military pressures. The territory's linguistic unity, based on emerging Romance dialects, provided cultural foundations for political cohesion that would prove crucial for long-term stability. Louis the German obtained East Francia, consisting of all territories east of the Rhine along with portions of the Rhineland that provided strategic control over crucial river crossings and commercial routes. This eastern kingdom included the Saxon territories, Bavaria, Alemannia, and the eastern marches that required strong military leadership to defend against Slavic and Magyar incursions. The kingdom's ethnic diversity, encompassing various Germanic tribes with distinct cultural traditions, created challenges for political unification, while providing military resources that would enable successful expansion into Slavic territories during subsequent centuries. Lothair retained the imperial title along with Middle Francia, a geographically awkward territory that stretched from the North Sea to central Italy, including the Low Countries, Lotharingia, Burgundy, Provence, and the Italian peninsula. This Middle Kingdom controlled crucial commercial routes connecting northern and southern Europe while encompassing the traditional centres of Carolingian power, including Aachen and Rome. However, The territory's elongated shape and ethnic diversity created inherent vulnerabilities that would lead to its eventual fragmentation and absorption by neighbouring kingdoms. The implementation of the Treaty of Verdun's territorial divisions immediately revealed the practical impossibilities inherent in the tripartite arrangement, as the three brothers discovered that effective governance required constant negotiation over shared resources, disputed boundaries, and competing claims to ecclesiastical appointments. Charles the Bald's assumption of authority over West Francia brought him face to face with entrenched regional aristocracies who had exploited decades of civil warfare to consolidate their own power bases, while the kingdom's extensive coastline made it particularly vulnerable to the Viking raids that intensified dramatically during the 840s. The young king, barely 20 years old at Verdun, possessed neither his grandfather's military reputation nor the administrative experience necessary to command immediate respect from nobles who remembered when his very existence had triggered imperial civil war. The West Frankish nobility's resistance to centralized royal authority manifested most clearly in their reluctance to provide military service for campaigns beyond their immediate territorial interests. The great magnates, men like Robert the Strong in Neustria, Gerard of Roussillon in Burgundy, and Ranulf I in Aquitaine, had accumulated vast landed estates during the succession crisis and maintained private armies that rivaled royal forces in size and equipment. These aristocrats viewed Charles's attempts to reassert royal prerogatives as threats to the autonomous authority they had enjoyed during the chaotic 830s, leading to a pattern of grudging cooperation punctuated by outright rebellion whenever royal demands exceeded their tolerance. The kingdom's financial resources, severely depleted by years of civil conflict, proved inadequate for maintaining the extensive military forces necessary to defend against external threats while suppressing internal rebellions. The royal treasury, traditionally replenished through tribute from conquered territories and profits from royal estates, faced unprecedented demands as Viking raiders targeted the wealthy monasteries and commercial centres that had provided much of the crown's revenue. Charles's attempts to increase taxation on noble estates met fierce resistance from aristocrats who claimed ancient privileges exempting them from royal levies, forcing the king to rely on ecclesiastical resources that generated resentment among church leaders. The Viking threat to West Francia intensified dramatically after 845 when Ragnar's fleet sailed up the Seine and captured Paris, extracting a massive tribute of £7,000 of silver before withdrawing. This successful raid demonstrated the vulnerability of Frankish river systems to seaborne attacks while revealing the inadequacy of existing defensive arrangements that had been designed primarily to counter land-based invasions. The Vikings' shallow draft longships could navigate far inland along the Seine, Loire and Garonne rivers, enabling them to strike at targets hundreds of miles from the coast before royal forces could respond effectively. Charles the Bald's initial responses to Viking incursions reflected the limited options available to a monarch whose military resources were stretched thin by competing demands. The king's attempts to organise coordinated resistance foundered on the reluctance of regional magnates to commit their forces to campaigns that primarily benefited other territories. While his efforts to negotiate tribute payments generated criticism from nobles who viewed such arrangements as shameful capitulation to pagan enemies, the construction of fortified bridges across major rivers begun in the 860s represented a more successful defensive strategy that combined engineering innovation with practical military necessity. The fortified bridges at Pont de l'Arche on the Seine and similar structures on other rivers employed sophisticated construction techniques that reflected the survival of Roman engineering knowledge within Carolingian administrative circles. These installations featured stone piers supporting wooden superstructures that could be dismantled quickly to prevent enemy passage, while adjacent fortifications housed permanent garrisons equipped with crossbows and other weapons effective against Viking raiders. The bridge's strategic placement at narrow points, where rivers could be completely blocked, forced Viking fleets to attempt costly assaults on prepared positions rather than bypassing defences through alternative routes. The effectiveness of these defensive measures became apparent during the Siege of Paris in 885-886, when Count Odo's successful defence of the fortified bridges prevented a massive Viking army from advancing further up the Seine. The siege, lasting nearly a year, demonstrated both the resilience of well-prepared Frankish defences and the continuing limitations of royal authority when confronted by determined enemies. Charles the Fat's eventual arrival with a relief army resulted in another tribute payment rather than decisive military victory, highlighting the persistent gap between Carolingian ambitions and capabilities. The noble rebellions that plagued Charles the Bald's reign reflected deeper structural problems within West Frankish society that transcended personal conflicts between king and aristocrats. The magnates' resistance to royal authority stemmed partly from their control over vast territorial complexes that functioned as semi-independent principalities with their own administrative systems, military forces, and economic resources. Men like Robert the Strong had accumulated counties, abbacies, and other offices that provided them with revenues exceeding those available to the king himself, creating power imbalances that made effective royal governance nearly impossible. The rebellion of 858, led by Robert the Strong and supported by Louis the German's intervention, illustrated the international dimensions of West Frankish political instability. Robert's ability to coordinate with the East Frankish king demonstrated the continuing connections between aristocratic families across the newly established borders, while Louis's willingness to support rebels against his brother revealed the fragility of the Verdun settlement. The rebellion's ultimate failure resulted more from Louis the German's inability to sustain military operations in Western territories than from Charles the Bald's effective countermeasures. The ecclesiastical dimension of these political conflicts added religious legitimacy to what might otherwise have appeared as simple power struggles between competing aristocratic factions. Bishops and abbots, many of whom owed their appointments to royal favour, found themselves caught between loyalty to the crown and pressure from local magnates who controlled the landed estates that supported their institutions. The resulting compromises often involved complex arrangements where ecclesiastical leaders acknowledged royal authority in spiritual matters while accepting noble influence over temporal affairs. Louis the German's consolidation of East Francia proceeded along different lines that reflected both the kingdom's distinct ethnic composition and the particular challenges posed by its extensive frontier borders with Slavic territories. The Eastern Kingdom's population included Saxons, Bavarians, Alemanni, and Franks, each group maintaining distinct legal traditions, cultural practices, and political structures that required careful accommodation within a unified governmental system. Louis's success in managing this diversity stemmed partly from his willingness to work through existing tribal leadership structures, rather than attempting to impose uniform administrative arrangements throughout his territories. The development of the stem duchies in East Francia represented Louis the German's most significant contribution to medieval German political organisation. These territorial units, Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia, combined tribal identity with administrative efficiency by granting extensive autonomy to regional leaders while maintaining their subordination to royal authority. The dukes who governed these territories possessed hereditary claims to leadership within their respective tribal groups, but their authority derived ultimately from royal appointment and could be revoked for disloyalty or incompetence. The Saxon duchy under the leadership of the Liudolfing family exemplified the successful integration of tribal traditions with Carolingian administrative practices. The Liudolfings had established their prominence through military service against Slavic enemies and careful cultivation of relationships with both royal authorities and local aristocrats. Their control over the Saxon duchy provided them with the resources necessary to conduct continuous warfare against the Sorbs, Obotrites and other Slavic peoples, while maintaining internal stability through patronage networks that rewarded loyal supporters with land grants and administrative positions. The Bavarian duchy presented different challenges due to its history of semi-independence and the continuing influence of the Agilolfing family's former supporters. Louis the German's decision to grant the duchy to his eldest son Carloman in 865 reflected both the territory's strategic importance and the need for strong leadership to coordinate defence against Magyar incursions. Carloman's administration of Bavaria demonstrated the effectiveness of combining royal authority with regional expertise, as his familiarity with local conditions enabled him to organise successful military campaigns while maintaining the loyalty of Bavarian aristocrats. The Eastern Frontier's military requirements shaped the development of distinctive East Frankish institutions that differed markedly from those emerging in West Francia. The continuous warfare against Slavic peoples necessitated the maintenance of large cavalry forces equipped for rapid deployment across vast distances, while the need to defend scattered settlements required extensive networks of fortified positions that could shelter local populations during enemy raids. These military necessities encouraged the development of a warrior aristocracy whose primary obligations involved frontier defence rather than the court service that characterised West Frankish nobility. The Slavic campaigns conducted by Louis the German and his sons achieved significant territorial expansion, while demonstrating the military effectiveness of East Frankish forces when properly organised and equipped. The conquest of Moravia in 864 extended Frankish authority deep into Central Europe, while successful operations against the Sorbs secured the Elbe frontier and opened new territories for German settlement. These victories provided the kingdom with tribute payments, slave labour and agricultural lands that enhanced its economic resources, while establishing East Francia as the dominant power in Central Europe. The ecclesiastical organisation of conquered Slavic territories required careful coordination between military conquest and religious conversion that reflected Louis the German's understanding of the relationship between political control and cultural assimilation. The establishment of new bishoprics at strategic locations provided institutional frameworks for promoting Christian conversion, while creating administrative centres that could coordinate governance of diverse populations. The appointment of German-speaking clergy to these positions ensured loyalty to East Frankish interests, while facilitating communication between royal administrators and local populations. The problematic inheritance of Middle Francia became apparent immediately after Lothair's death in 855, as the kingdom's geographic awkwardness and ethnic diversity made unified governance nearly impossible, while its strategic importance ensured continued interference from neighbouring rulers. Lothair's division of his territories among his three sons created additional complications, as the resulting kingdoms lacked both the resources necessary for independent survival and the geographic coherence required for effective administration. Louis II received Italy along with the imperial title, while Lothair II obtained the northern territories that would become known as Lotharingia, and Charles received Provence and the Rhone Valley. The rapid disintegration of these arrangements began with Charles of Provence's death in 863, which left his territories without clear succession arrangements and created opportunities for intervention by his uncles Charles the Bald and Louis the German. The subsequent partition of Provence between the two surviving Carolingian kingdoms established precedents for the eventual absorption of all Middle Frankish territories by neighbouring powers, while demonstrating the continuing importance of family relationships in determining territorial arrangements. Lothair II's marriage difficulties with Teutberga created a succession crisis that involved papal authority, imperial politics, and regional noble interests in complex negotiations that ultimately weakened royal authority throughout Middle Francia. The king's attempts to divorce his wife in order to marry his concubine Waldrada required ecclesiastical approval that proved impossible to obtain, despite extensive diplomatic efforts and significant financial inducements. The controversy's resolution through papal intervention established important precedents for church involvement in royal marriages, while demonstrating the limitations of royal authority when confronted by determined ecclesiastical opposition. The death of Lothair II in 869 without legitimate male heirs precipitated the final partition of Middle Francia through the Treaty of Meersen, which divided Lotharingia between Charles the Bald and Louis the German according to linguistic and cultural criteria that reflected emerging national identities. The western portions, where Romance dialects predominated, joined West Francia, while the eastern territories with Germanic populations became part of East Francia. This arrangement, while logical from cultural and administrative perspectives, created strategic vulnerabilities that would influence European political development for centuries. The gradual weakening of imperial authority throughout the later 9th century reflected both the practical impossibility of governing the vast Carolingian territories from a single centre and the emergence of regional power structures that no longer required royal legitimation for effective governance. The multiplication of royal titles as various Carolingian branches claimed authority over different territories created confusion about legitimate succession, while encouraging local magnates to choose sides based on immediate political advantage rather than dynastic loyalty. The result was a progressive fragmentation of political authority that transformed the unified empire created by Charlemagne into a collection of competing kingdoms and principalities. The rise of regional power centres accelerated as local magnates accumulated offices, territories and resources that enabled them to function as independent rulers within their respective spheres of influence. In West Francia, families like the Robertians built territorial complexes that spanned multiple counties and duchies, while their control over strategic fortifications and river crossings gave them influence over commercial networks that generated substantial revenues. Similar developments occurred throughout the former Carolingian territories as ambitious aristocrats exploited royal weakness to establish hereditary control over previously temporary administrative positions. The Viking settlement of Normandy in 911 represented the most dramatic example of this political fragmentation, as Charles the Simple's grant of territorial authority to Rollo acknowledged the reality of Scandinavian control over the lower Seine Valley, while attempting to convert Viking raiders into defenders of Frankish interests. This arrangement established precedents for the legitimation of conquest through royal recognition that would influence medieval political development throughout Europe, while demonstrating the extent to which traditional concepts of royal authority had been modified by practical necessities. The transformation of Viking activity from sporadic raiding to systematic conquest and settlement fundamentally altered the political landscape of Western Europe during the second half of the 9th century, as Scandinavian warriors exploited Carolingian weakness to establish permanent footholds throughout Francia, England, and Ireland. The great army that landed in East Anglia in 865 represented a qualitatively different threat from earlier Viking expeditions, consisting not of seasonal raiders seeking quick profits, but of professional warriors intent on territorial conquest and political domination. This force, numbering several thousand men under the leadership of Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, possessed the organisational sophistication and logistical capabilities necessary to sustain multi-year campaigns across vast distances while adapting their tactics to local conditions and defensive arrangements. The Vikings' military effectiveness derived from their combination of superior mobility, tactical flexibility, and ruthless exploitation of Frankish political divisions that prevented coordinated resistance to their incursions. Their shallow draft longships could navigate rivers inaccessible to traditional Frankish vessels, enabling rapid deployment of forces far inland while maintaining secure lines of communication and retreat to coastal bases. The ships themselves, constructed with overlapping planks and flexible joints that could withstand the stresses of river navigation and beach landings, represented technological innovations that gave Scandinavian forces decisive advantages over opponents constrained by conventional military thinking. Viking warriors employed weapons and armour that reflected centuries of metalworking expertise developed in Scandinavia's iron-rich regions, where skilled smiths had perfected techniques for creating superior steel implements that maintained sharp edges and structural integrity under combat conditions. The typical Viking warrior carried a double-edged sword with pattern-welded blade, round wooden shield reinforced with iron boss and rim, and throwing spears designed for both close combat and ranged attacks. Wealthy leaders wore mail shirts imported from Frankish territories or captured during successful raids, while their followers relied on leather armour reinforced with metal studs that provided protection against slashing weapons, while maintaining mobility essential for their preferred fighting style. The psychological impact of Viking warfare proved as devastating as their material destruction, as Scandinavian raiders deliberately employed terror tactics designed to paralyze resistance and encourage submission from targeted populations. Contemporary chronicles describe Viking practices of ritual execution, torture of prisoners, and deliberate desecration of religious sites that violated fundamental Christian concepts of warfare while demonstrating contempt for the religious foundations of Carolingian civilization. The Vikings' reputation for savagery, while often exaggerated by Christian chroniclers, reflected genuine cultural differences in approaches to violence and conquest that made accommodation between Scandinavian and Frankish societies extremely difficult. The Siege of Paris from November 885 to October 886 represented the culmination of Viking military capabilities and the nadir of Carolingian defensive effectiveness, as a massive Scandinavian army under Siegfried's leadership demonstrated their ability to conduct sophisticated siege operations against major urban centres while maintaining cohesion during extended campaigns. The Viking force, estimated at 700 ships and 30,000 warriors, had sailed up the Seine during the autumn of 885 with the intention of continuing inland to attack Burgundy and other wealthy regions that had previously escaped major devastation. The fortified bridges constructed during Charles the Bald's reign blocked their passage at Paris, forcing the Vikings to attempt the reduction of these defensive works through direct assault and systematic siege techniques. Count Odo's defence of Paris showcased both the potential effectiveness of well-prepared Frankish resistance and the limitations of royal authority when confronted by determined enemies who possessed superior numbers and equipment. Odo, a member of the powerful Robertian family that controlled extensive territories in Neustria, commanded a garrison of approximately 200 professional warriors supplemented by urban militia and clerical defenders who understood that the city's fall would expose the entire Seine Valley to Viking devastation. The defenders' preparations included stockpiling of food supplies, repair of fortifications, and coordination with neighbouring strongholds that could provide mutual support during the anticipated siege. The initial Viking assault on the fortified bridges employed massive siege engines, constructed from local timber under the direction of experienced engineers who understood the principles of leverage and counterweight systems necessary for breaching stone fortifications. The attackers built enormous catapults, capable of hurling stones weighing several hundred pounds against the bridge towers, while mobile wooden shelters protected crews operating battering rams, designed to destroy the masonry foundations that supported the defensive structures. These engineering works demonstrated the Vikings' adaptation of continental siege techniques learned during previous campaigns, contradicting contemporary Christian assumptions about Scandinavian military primitiveness. The defenders' response to these attacks reveal the sophisticated defensive innovations that had developed within Carolingian military circles during decades of Viking pressure. Odo's forces employed Greek fire, crossbows, and coordinated sally tactics that maximized their advantages in defensive terrain, while minimizing their numerical disadvantages against Viking assault forces. The garrison's use of incendiary weapons proved particularly effective against Viking siege engines, as the wooden construction of catapults and shelters made them vulnerable to fire arrows and combustible liquids that could be deployed from the safety of stone fortifications. The siege's duration through the harsh winter of 885-886 tested both sides' logistical capabilities and organisational cohesion under conditions of extreme hardship that claimed hundreds of casualties from disease, exposure, and malnutrition. The Vikings' ability to maintain their army's effectiveness during months of static warfare demonstrated remarkable administrative sophistication as their leaders organised foraging expeditions, managed food distribution, and maintained discipline among warriors accustomed to mobile campaigns and immediate rewards. The defenders faced equally severe challenges in maintaining morale and combat readiness, while enduring constant threat of assault and the psychological pressure of isolation from external support. The arrival of Charles the Fat with a relief army in October 886 initially appeared to herald decisive Frankish victory, as the emperor commanded forces that significantly outnumbered the Viking besiegers while possessing superior heavy cavalry that could exploit the open terrain surrounding Paris. However, Charles's decision to negotiate tribute payment rather than risk battle revealed the fundamental weakness of imperial authority and the extent to which Carolingian military capabilities had deteriorated since Charlemagne's time. The emperor's agreement to pay £700 of silver in exchange for Viking withdrawal generated widespread criticism from nobles who viewed such arrangements as shameful capitulation that encouraged further enemy demands. The emergence of powerful noble families as autonomous regional authorities accelerated dramatically during the Viking crisis, as aristocrats who successfully defended their territories against Scandinavian attacks gained prestige and resources that enabled them to challenge royal prerogatives with increasing boldness. The Robertian family's rise to prominence exemplified this process, as their effective leadership during the Paris siege established their reputation as the kingdom's primary defenders, while demonstrating royal inadequacy in protecting vital national interests. Count Odo's subsequent election as King of West Francia in 888 represented the logical culmination of this transfer of authority from ineffective Carolingian rulers to competent regional leaders. Robert the Strong's earlier campaigns against Viking raiders in the Loire Valley had established the family's military credentials while providing them with extensive territorial holdings that formed the foundation for their later political dominance. Robert's death in battle against Vikings at Brissart in 866 enhanced his reputation as a martyred defender of Christian civilization, while ensuring that his sons inherited both substantial material resources and the moral authority that derived from their father's sacrifice. The Robertians' subsequent accumulation of counties, abbacies, and military commands throughout Neustria created a territorial complex that rivaled royal domains in extent and exceeded them in effective governance. Similar processes occurred throughout the former Carolingian territories, as local strongmen who proved capable of organising effective resistance to external threats accumulated power and authority that had previously belonged to royal officials. In Flanders, Baldwin Ironarm established control over the coastal regions through his marriage to Charles the Bald's daughter Judith and his successful defence against Viking incursions, creating a principality that would remain largely independent of royal authority for centuries. The Count's fortification of strategic positions along the Scheldt and other rivers provided security for commercial activities that generated revenues far exceeding those available to impoverished royal administrations. The Marquis of Gothia, Bernard Plantavelou, demonstrated similar independence in organising the defence of southern Francia against both Viking raiders and Saracen incursions from Spain, accumulating territorial authority that extended from the Pyrenees to the Rhone Valley. Bernard's success in coordinating resistance efforts among previously fractious southern nobles established precedents for regional confederation that bypassed royal authority, while providing more effective governance than distant monarchs could offer. His control over strategic mountain passes and commercial routes enabled him to function as an independent ruler whose authority derived from demonstrated competence rather than royal appointment. The crisis of royal authority reached its nadir with the deposition of Charles the Fat in 887, an event that effectively ended any pretense of unified Carolingian governance, while demonstrating the complete breakdown of the political system created by Charlemagne's conquests. Charles's accumulation of multiple royal titles through inheritance and election had briefly reunited most of the former Carolingian territories under single authority, creating hopes for restored imperial unity and effective resistance to external threats. However, the emperor's obvious incompetence, demonstrated most clearly during the Paris siege negotiations, convinced regional elites that continued Carolingian rule threatened their survival and prosperity. The assembly at Triber in November 887 that formally deposed Charles the Fat represented a coordinated effort by East Frankish magnates to replace ineffective royal leadership with more competent alternatives who could address the kingdom's military and administrative challenges. The nobles' selection of Arnulf of Carinthia, Charles's illegitimate nephew, as their new king reflected both the continuing importance of Carolingian bloodlines for legitimacy and their determination to choose rulers based on demonstrated capability rather than strict hereditary succession. Arnulf's reputation as a successful military commander in campaigns against Slavic enemies provided the credentials necessary for acceptance by aristocrats who prioritized effective leadership over legal niceties. The simultaneous fragmentation of West Francia following Charles the Fat's deposition revealed the extent to which regional identities and interests had superseded loyalty to central authority during decades of ineffective royal governance. The election of Odo as king by the Western nobles represented their recognition that Robertian leadership offered better prospects for defence against Viking threats than continued adherence to Carolingian traditions that had proven inadequate for contemporary challenges. However, the competing claims of Charles the Simple, representing the legitimate Carolingian line, created succession disputes that further weakened royal authority while encouraging noble autonomy. The economic disruption caused by constant warfare and Viking depredations fundamentally altered the commercial networks that had sustained Carolingian prosperity during the 8th and early 9th centuries, as traders and craftsmen abandoned routes that had become too dangerous for profitable operation. The destruction of major commercial centres like Quentovich, Dorestad, and numerous riverside settlements eliminated crucial nodes in the trading systems that had connected northern and southern Europe through river transport and overland routes. The resulting economic fragmentation forced local communities to become increasingly self-sufficient while reducing the surplus wealth that had supported royal administration and cultural activities. Urban decline accelerated as merchants and artisans fled to more secure rural locations or emigrated to regions beyond Viking reach, leaving once prosperous cities with drastically reduced populations and economic activities. The abandonment of specialised crafts and commercial services that had characterised Carolingian urban centres forced communities to revert to simpler economic arrangements based primarily on agricultural production and local exchange. This devolution had profound implications for technological development, cultural transmission, and administrative sophistication that would influence European development for generations. The transformation of trade networks reflected both the immediate impact of Viking disruption and longer-term adaptations to changed security conditions that favoured different commercial strategies and routes. Merchants who continued operating during this period increasingly relied on overland routes that avoided vulnerable river systems, while the development of fortified market towns provided secure locations for commercial activities that could withstand periodic raids. The emergence of new trading partnerships with Scandinavian merchants who had settled in conquered territories created opportunities for economic recovery, though these arrangements required fundamental changes in traditional commercial practices and relationships. The fragmentation of monetary systems accompanied commercial disruption as regional authorities began issuing their own coinage to serve local needs, while royal mints ceased functioning effectively due to lack of silver supplies and administrative breakdown. The proliferation of different currency standards complicated interregional trade while reflecting the political fragmentation that had replaced unified Carolingian governance. Local coinages often employed reduced silver content or alternative metals that maintained purchasing power within limited geographical areas while becoming unacceptable in distant markets. Agricultural production suffered severely from the combination of direct Viking attacks on rural settlements and the broader disruption of social and economic relationships that had sustained Carolingian rural prosperity. The destruction of monasteries and their extensive agricultural estates eliminated major sources of surplus production, while disrupting the technological innovations and improved farming techniques that monastic communities had developed and disseminated. The flight of rural populations to fortified locations or distant regions reduced the labour force available for agricultural work, while abandoning previously cultivated lands to wilderness. The collapse of effective royal administration eliminated the legal and institutional frameworks that had regulated agricultural production, land tenure, and commercial relationships throughout the Carolingian period. Local strongmen who assumed authority over abandoned territories often lacked the administrative expertise or institutional memory necessary to maintain complex agricultural systems, leading to simplified arrangements that reduced overall productivity while providing greater security for reduced populations. The development of more localized economic relationships reflected both practical necessities and the breakdown of larger political and commercial structures that had characterized the Carolingian Empire at its height. The death of Charles the Fat in 888 marked the effective end of unified Carolingian rule, but the dynasty's struggle for survival continued through a series of increasingly desperate attempts at restoration that revealed both the persistent appeal of Carolingian legitimacy and the fundamental changes in European political structures that made such restoration ultimately impossible. Charles the Simple's eventual recognition as King of West Francia in 898, following a decade of civil war with the Robertian usurper Odo, represented not a genuine revival of Carolingian power, but rather a temporary accommodation between competing noble factions who found it convenient to maintain the fiction of royal authority while exercising real control through their own territorial networks and military resources. And the young Carolingian's physical appearance and demeanour reflected the dynasty's reduced circumstances, as contemporary chroniclers described a man of modest stature and unremarkable bearing who lacked the commanding presence that had characterised his great predecessors. Charles's pale complexion, thinning hair, and nervous mannerisms suggested a ruler more comfortable with scholarly pursuits than the brutal realities of 9th century warfare, though his education in classical Latin and canon law provided him with intellectual credentials that exceeded those of most contemporary monarchs. His court at Laon, while maintaining the ceremonial trappings of royal dignity, operated on a fraction of the resources available to earlier Carolingian rulers, with a handful of clerical advisors and a small retinue of household knights, replacing the elaborate administrative apparatus that had once governed half of Europe. The restoration of Charles the Simple occurred within the context of continued Viking pressure that had forced even the most independent-minded nobles to recognise the advantages of coordinated resistance under royal leadership, however nominal that leadership might be in practice. The Great Army's establishment of permanent bases along the Seine, Loire, and other major rivers had created a strategic situation where individual noble strongholds, regardless of their local strength, remained vulnerable to coordinated Scandinavian attacks that could overwhelm isolated defenders through superior numbers and mobility. The Robertians' decision to support Charles's restoration reflected their calculation that royal legitimacy could facilitate the broader coalitions necessary for effective anti-Viking warfare while preserving their own regional autonomy within a revived monarchical framework. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 between Charles the Simple and the Viking leader Rollo represented the most significant diplomatic achievement of the late Carolingian period, establishing the Duchy of Normandy as a buffer state that would transform former raiders into defenders of Frankish interests, while creating precedents for the integration of foreign warrior elites into existing political structures. The negotiations, conducted at the monastery of St. Clair under ecclesiastical supervision, required careful balance between Frankish desires for security and Viking demands for territorial recognition that acknowledged their conquest rights, while providing legal frameworks for continued settlement and expansion. Rollo himself embodied the cultural transformations occurring throughout Viking-dominated territories, as the Norwegian chieftain had adapted his leadership style to accommodate both Scandinavian warrior traditions and Frankish administrative practices that governed his new subjects. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and scarred hands of a veteran warrior, Rollo possessed the physical presence necessary to command respect from his diverse followers, while demonstrating sufficient political sophistication to negotiate complex agreements with Carolingian officials. His conversion to Christianity, symbolized by his baptism at Rouen Cathedral in 912, represented more than mere political convenience, as the ceremony established religious foundations for Norman identity that would influence European development for centuries. The territorial arrangements established by the Saint-Clair-sur-Epte Treaty granted Rollo authority over the Lower Seine Valley and adjacent coastal regions, encompassing approximately 10,000 square miles of fertile agricultural land and strategic commercial centres that provided the economic foundation for Norman power. The duchy's boundaries, defined by natural features including rivers and forest margins, created defensible frontiers that could be fortified against external threats while facilitating internal communication and administration. The treaty's provisions for additional territorial grants, contingent upon successful defence against other Viking raiders, established incentive structures that align Norman interests with broader Frankish security concerns. The implementation of these arrangements required extensive consultation between Norman and Frankish legal traditions that resulted in hybrid institutional structures combining Scandinavian personal loyalty relationships with Carolingian administrative practices. Rollo's establishment of a ducal court at Rouen incorporated both Viking assemblies, where warriors could voice opinions on military matters, and Frankish chancery procedures that produced written records of legal decisions and territorial grants. The integration of existing Frankish populations with Scandinavian settlers created complex social hierarchies where ethnic identity, military service and land tenure intersected in ways that challenged traditional medieval social categories. The Norman military organisation that emerged from this cultural synthesis proved remarkably effective in subsequent conflicts, combining Viking tactical flexibility with Frankish heavy cavalry techniques that maximised the advantages of both military traditions. Norman warriors retained their ancestors' emphasis on individual prowess and aggressive tactics, while adopting Carolingian innovations in armour, weapons and battlefield coordination that enhanced their effectiveness against diverse enemies. The development of distinctive Norman fighting styles, particularly their use of mounted combat, combined with rapid dismounted assaults, would influence medieval warfare throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world. The economic transformation of Normandy under Rollo's leadership demonstrated the Vikings' remarkable adaptability to settled agricultural life, as former raiders became successful farmers, merchants and craftsmen who contributed to regional prosperity while maintaining their military capabilities. The restoration of abandoned agricultural estates and the establishment of new settlements along river valleys created surplus production that supported population growth and commercial development throughout the duchy. Norman merchants quickly established trading networks that connected Scandinavian markets with Frankish commercial centres, generating revenues that enabled continued military expansion and territorial consolidation. The ecclesiastical integration of Normandy into the broader Catholic world required careful negotiation between Norman political autonomy and papal authority that established precedents for church-state relations throughout medieval Europe. The restoration of destroyed monasteries and the foundation of new religious houses provided institutional frameworks for cultural assimilation, while preserving Norman political independence from external ecclesiastical control. The appointment of Norman nobles to episcopal positions created religious hierarchies that supported ducal authority, while maintaining communion with Rome and other Catholic centres. The gradual emergence of the Capetian dynasty as the primary challenger to Carolingian authority in West Francia reflected broader changes in European political culture that favoured proven military competence over hereditary claims to legitimacy. Hugh the Great's accumulation of territorial authority throughout northern Francia during the early 10th century demonstrated the continuing vitality of Robertian political strategies that combined effective local governance with strategic marriage alliances and military leadership. His control over the crucial territories between Paris and the Norman frontier provided him with resources and strategic position that enabled him to function as the kingdom's de facto ruler, while maintaining the fiction of Carolingian royal authority. The Robertian family's territorial complex encompassed dozens of counties, abbacies and strategic fortifications that generated revenues far exceeding those available to the impoverished Carolingian crown, while their network of marriage alliances connected them with powerful noble families throughout Francia and beyond. Hugh the Great's sister's marriage to Rudolph of Burgundy created connections with the emerging Burgundian kingdom, while his own matrimonial arrangements with German and Italian noble houses established diplomatic relationships that enhanced Robertian influence in international affairs. These connections provided the family with military support and political intelligence that proved crucial during succession crises and territorial disputes. The military innovations developed within Robertian territories reflected their practical experience in defending against Viking raids and suppressing noble rebellions, as Hugh the Great's forces employed tactical flexibility and logistical sophistication that distinguished them from traditional Carolingian armies. The Robertian military organisation emphasised rapid deployment of combined cavalry and infantry forces that could respond quickly to diverse threats, while maintaining the supply lines necessary for extended campaigns. Their use of fortified bases and coordinated operations across multiple fronts demonstrated strategic thinking that surpassed contemporary military practice throughout most of Europe. The death of Louis IV in 954 precipitated a succession crisis that revealed the complete transformation of political relationships within West Francia, as the young Lothairs' minority created opportunities for noble intervention that effectively ended any pretense of independent royal authority. Hugh the Great's assumption of regency responsibilities demonstrated Robertian dominance, while establishing precedents for noble control over royal administration that would characterize the final decades of Carolingian rule. The regency's success in maintaining territorial integrity and defending against external threats contrasted sharply with earlier periods of Carolingian weakness, highlighting the advantages of competent leadership over hereditary legitimacy. The simultaneous extinction of the Carolingian line in East Francia in 911 with the death of Louis the Child created fundamentally different political dynamics that would reshape Central European development for centuries. The East Frankish nobles' rejection of Carolingian succession claims and their election of Conrad I of Franconia represented a decisive break with dynastic tradition that established precedents for elective monarchy based on demonstrated competence rather than hereditary rights. Conrad's modest background as a regional duke contrasted sharply with the imperial pretensions of his Carolingian predecessors, while his election reflected the nobility's preference for manageable leadership that would respect regional autonomy while providing coordination for common defence. The challenges facing Conrad II's reign revealed the fundamental transformation of East Frankish political structures during decades of civil war and external pressure, as the stem duchies had evolved into virtually independent principalities whose cooperation with royal authority remained entirely voluntary. The Saxon Duke Henry the Fowler controlled territories and military resources that exceeded those available to the king himself, while his family's reputation for successful warfare against Slavic enemies provided them with prestige that challenged royal claims to military leadership. Similar situations existed in Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia, where ducal families had established hereditary control over their respective territories while maintaining only nominal subordination to royal authority. Conrad's attempts to reassert royal prerogatives through military action against recalcitrant dukes had demonstrated both his understanding of the challenges facing central authority and the limitations of royal resources when confronted by determined regional opposition. The king's campaigns against Saxon independence achieved temporary tactical successes, but ultimately failed to establish lasting royal control over Henry the Fowler's territories, while similar efforts in Bavaria and Swabia generated resentment without producing meaningful changes in the balance of power between royal and ducal authorities. These failures convinced Conrad that effective governance required accommodation with regional leaders rather than futile attempts to restore centralized control. The dying king's recommendation that the nobles elect Henry the Fowler as his successor represented a remarkable act of political wisdom that acknowledged the realities of contemporary power distribution while preserving institutional continuity through peaceful transition of authority. Conrad's recognition that Saxon military capabilities and territorial resources made Henry the only viable candidate for effective royal leadership demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political necessities that transcended personal or dynastic considerations. This recommendation established precedents for pragmatic succession arrangements that would influence German political development throughout the medieval period. Henry VI's election as King of East Francia in 919 marked the beginning of the Ottonian dynasty that would dominate Central European politics for over a century, while establishing the institutional foundations for the later Holy Roman Empire. The new monarch's physical appearance reflected his Saxon origins, as contemporary sources describe a tall, powerfully built man with a fair complexion and light hair, characteristic of northern Germanic peoples. His scarred hands and weathered features testified to decades of frontier warfare against Slavic enemies, while his direct manner of speech and informal court protocols demonstrated his preference for practical leadership over ceremonial display. The Saxon king's approach to governance reflected both his tribal background and his sophisticated understanding of the political realities that had destroyed Carolingian unity, as he consistently prioritized effective administration over theoretical claims to authority. Henry's decision to rule through existing ducal structures, rather than attempting to impose centralized control, demonstrated his recognition that successful monarchy required cooperation from regional elites who possessed independent sources of power and legitimacy. This pragmatic approach enabled him to achieve remarkable success in coordinating resistance to external threats while maintaining internal stability that had eluded his predecessors. The Hungarian threat that intensified during Henry's early reign posed challenges that exceeded those faced by any contemporary European ruler, as Magyar raiders employed superior mobility and tactical sophistication that rendered traditional defensive strategies ineffective. The Hungarian forces, consisting primarily of mounted archers equipped with composite bows and curved sabres, could cover vast distances with remarkable speed while avoiding pitched battles that might expose them to Germanic heavy cavalry. Their preferred tactics involved sudden raids on isolated settlements, followed by rapid withdrawal to fortified camps where pursuing enemies could be ambushed and destroyed through coordinated archery attacks. Henry's response to this threat demonstrated the military innovations that would characterize Ottonian warfare for generations, as he developed new tactical arrangements that combined Saxon infantry discipline with improved cavalry techniques adapted from Hungarian examples. The king's establishment of fortified towns throughout his territories provided secure bases for defensive operations, while creating obstacles that forced Hungarian raiders to accept battle on terms favourable to German forces. These fortifications, constructed with stone walls and defensive towers, housed permanent garrisons equipped with crossbows and other weapons, effective against mounted enemies. The decisive victory at Riad in 933 showcased the effectiveness of Henry's military reforms, while demonstrating the psychological impact of successful resistance against previously invincible enemies. The battle occurred when a large Hungarian army, returning from raids in Thuringia with extensive booty and captives, encountered Henry's forces in a carefully prepared defensive position that maximised German advantages while negating Hungarian mobility. The Saxon infantry, arranged in dense formations protected by wooden stakes and crossbow fire, absorbed the initial Hungarian assault before launching coordinated counterattacks that shattered the enemy formation and enabled devastating cavalry pursuits. The victory's aftermath revealed Henry's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military success and political authority, as he used his triumph to enhance royal prestige while strengthening the institutional foundations of Saxon monarchy. The king's distribution of Hungarian treasure among his followers created loyalty bonds that transcended traditional tribal relationships, while his establishment of new military colonies in conquered territories provided permanent bases for future expansion. The integration of captured Hungarian equipment and tactics into German military practice demonstrated the adaptability that would characterize Ottonian forces throughout their period of dominance. The reign of Otto I, beginning with his coronation in 936, represented the culmination of Saxon political development and the emergence of a new imperial ideology that combined Germanic kingship traditions with revived Roman imperial concepts. The elaborate coronation ceremony at Aachen, conducted in Charlemagne's palace chapel before assembled dukes and ecclesiastical dignitaries, symbolically connected Ottonian rule with Carolingian precedents while establishing distinctly Saxon characteristics that reflected contemporary political realities. Otto's physical presence, inherited from his father but enhanced by royal regalia and ceremonial protocols, commanded immediate respect from nobles accustomed to evaluating rulers based on personal qualities rather than hereditary claims. The new king's early reign witnessed systematic efforts to strengthen royal authority through strategic appointments and territorial reorganisation that built upon Henry's achievements while addressing remaining challenges to central control. Otto's appointment of family members to crucial ducal positions represented a calculated attempt to ensure loyalty while maintaining the federal structure that had proven effective under his father's leadership. His brother Henry received Bavaria, while other relatives obtained positions that provided them with substantial resources while binding them to royal interests through personal and familial obligations. The rebellion of 939, led by Otto's younger brother Henry, and supported by various ducal factions, tested the new king's political and military capabilities while revealing the continuing tensions between royal authority and regional autonomy that characterized German politics throughout the medieval period. The rebels' coordination with external enemies, including both Hungarian raiders and Slavic princes, demonstrated the international dimensions of German internal conflicts while highlighting the strategic vulnerabilities created by political fragmentation. Otto's successful suppression of this rebellion through a combination of military force and diplomatic negotiation established his reputation as an effective ruler while eliminating major challenges to his authority. The Italian expeditions that began in 951 with Otto's intervention in support of Adelaide of Burgundy represented a fundamental expansion of German political ambitions that would transform the nature of Ottonian kingship while creating lasting connections between German and Italian political development. The king's marriage to Adelaide, widow of King Lothair of Italy, provided legal justification for his assumption of Italian royal authority while establishing dynastic connections that would influence European politics for generations. Otto's coronation as King of Italy at Pavia symbolized the revival of Carolingian imperial ambitions while demonstrating German military superiority over contemporary Italian political arrangements. The papal appeal for German intervention against Berengar II of Ivrea created opportunities for Ottonian expansion, while establishing precedents for German involvement in Italian ecclesiastical affairs that would characterize medieval imperial policy. Pope John XIV's correspondence with Otto revealed the papacy's recognition that only German military power could provide effective protection against Italian enemies, while the king's response demonstrated his understanding of the religious legitimacy that papal support could provide for his expanding authority. The resulting alliance between German monarchy and papal authority created institutional frameworks that would survive for centuries despite periodic conflicts over specific policies and appointments. The imperial coronation of Otto in 962 by Pope John the XIV represented the revival of Western imperial dignity after nearly 4 decades of vacancy, while establishing the Holy Roman Empire as a distinct political entity that combined German royal authority with Italian territorial control and papal religious sanction. The ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica deliberately evoked Charlemagne's coronation while incorporating distinctly Ottonian elements that reflected contemporary political realities and religious developments. Otto's assumption of the imperial title created legal and symbolic foundations for German claims to universal Christian leadership while establishing institutional continuity with Carolingian precedents. The complex relationship between imperial authority and papal independence that emerged from this arrangement created tensions that would influence European political development throughout the medieval period, as both parties sought to maximize their respective advantages while maintaining the cooperation necessary for mutual survival. Otto's subsequent conflicts with John XII over temporal authority in Rome revealed the inherent contradictions between imperial claims to universal jurisdiction and papal assertions of spiritual supremacy, while establishing patterns of negotiation and conflict that would characterize church-state relations for centuries. The gradual dissolution of centralized Carolingian authority during the 10th and 11th centuries precipitated fundamental transformations in European administrative structures that would define medieval governance for centuries to come. The Missi Dominici system, once the backbone of imperial oversight, evolved into increasingly localized arrangements, as regional magnates assumed permanent control over territories they had initially governed as temporary royal appointees. Count Baldwin II of Flanders exemplified this transformation, converting his original mandate to defend the coastal regions against Viking incursions into hereditary lordship over vast territories stretching from the Scheldt to the Somme rivers. His fortress at Bruges, constructed initially as a defensive outpost, became the administrative centre of a principality whose authority derived from demonstrated competence rather than royal delegation. The metamorphosis of Carolingian administrative positions into hereditary fiefs occurred through a complex process of legal innovation and practical accommodation that reflected both the breakdown of central authority and the emergence of new concepts of political legitimacy based on personal relationships rather than institutional hierarchy. The Count's original obligation to provide military service in exchange for temporary land grants gradually transformed into permanent tenure arrangements where noble families retained control over territories across multiple generations while maintaining nominal acknowledgement of royal supremacy. This evolution required extensive legal justification that drew upon both Germanic traditions of personal loyalty and Roman concepts of property rights to create hybrid institutional structures that served contemporary political needs. The development of vassalage as the fundamental organizing principle of medieval political relationships emerged from these practical arrangements as ambitious nobles sought to formalize their authority over subordinate warriors and administrators who controlled smaller territorial units within their expanding domains. The ceremonial aspects of homage and fealty that characterized mature feudal relationships developed gradually from simple oaths of military service into elaborate rituals that defined mutual obligations between lords and vassals with increasing precision and complexity. The ceremony typically occurred in the Lord's Great Hall before assembled witnesses, where the prospective vassal knelt with bare head and placed his hands between those of his lord while swearing oaths of loyalty and service that created binding legal relationships enforceable through established judicial procedures. The physical symbolism embedded in these ceremonies reflected deep-seated cultural values regarding honour, loyalty and social hierarchy that had evolved from Germanic warrior traditions while incorporating Christian concepts of sacred obligation that invested feudal relationships with religious significance. The vassal's act of kneeling demonstrated his voluntary submission to superior authority, while the lord's acceptance of his hands symbolized the protective relationship that formed the foundation of feudal governance. The exchange of symbolic objects, typically a sword, banner or piece of earth, represented the transfer of specific rights and obligations that define the terms of their relationship, while creating tangible evidence of the agreement that could be referenced in future disputes. The territorial basis of these relationships required sophisticated legal frameworks that could accommodate the complex overlapping jurisdictions and competing claims that characterized feudal landholding and arrangements. A single piece of territory might simultaneously be held as a fief from multiple lords through different legal traditions, creating situations where vassals owed competing obligations that could conflict during periods of political crisis. The development of liege homage as a superior form of feudal relationship attempted to resolve these conflicts by establishing hierarchies of obligation that prioritized service to one lord above all others, though the practical implementation of these arrangements often proved problematic when theoretical loyalties conflicted with immediate political necessities. The economic foundations of feudal relationships reflected the transformation of Carolingian land grants from temporary administrative arrangements into permanent sources of income that enabled noble families to maintain their military and political obligations across multiple generations. The typical fief encompassed agricultural estates worked by peasant tenants whose labour provided the surplus production necessary to support mounted warriors and their equipment, while also generating revenues that could fund castle construction, military campaigns, and the elaborate household establishments that demonstrated noble status. The manor house that served as the administrative centre of these estates evolved from simple fortified residences into complex architectural arrangements that combined defensive capabilities with the ceremonial spaces necessary for conducting feudal business and maintaining social relationships. The agricultural techniques employed on feudal estates reflected both the preservation of Carolingian innovations and new developments that emerged from the practical necessities of supporting military households in an increasingly fragmented political environment. The three-field system of crop rotation originally promoted through Carolingian capitularies, continue to provide the foundation for agricultural productivity, while new technologies including improved ploughs, watermills and horse harnesses increase the efficiency of rural production. The integration of these technological advances with traditional farming practices enabled feudal estates to support larger populations while generating the surplus wealth necessary for maintaining the military capabilities that justified noble authority. The preservation and transmission of classical learning through monastic scriptoriums represented one of the most significant achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance, creating intellectual foundations that would support medieval scholarship and cultural development throughout the feudal period. The monastery of St. Gall in modern Switzerland exemplified the sophisticated institutional arrangements that enabled religious communities to maintain extensive libraries and copying operations, despite the political instability that characterized the post-Carolingian era. The monastery's scriptorium, housed in specially constructed buildings with large windows that provided optimal lighting conditions, employed teams of trained scribes who worked under the supervision of learned monks to produce accurate copies of classical texts, patristic writings, and contemporary scholarly works. The technical innovations developed within Carolingian scriptoriums established standards for manuscript production that would influence European literary culture for centuries, as the standardized procedures for preparing parchment, mixing inks, and organizing page layouts created visual consistency that facilitated the transmission of texts across vast geographical distances. The development of systematic abbreviation conventions enabled scribes to reduce the time required for copying lengthy works while maintaining textual accuracy, while the use of distinctive scripts for different types of content helped readers navigate complex manuscripts that might contain multiple works by various authors. The integration of illuminated initials and decorative elements with textual content created manuscripts that served both practical and aesthetic functions while demonstrating the cultural sophistication of their monastic creators. The educational curricula preserved within monastic schools provided the intellectual foundation for medieval learning while adapting Carolingian educational innovations to contemporary needs and resources. The trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic continued to form the basis for elementary education, while the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music provided advanced instruction for students preparing for ecclesiastical careers or administrative positions within feudal hierarchies. The preservation of classical Latin texts within monastic libraries ensured that medieval scholars retained access to Roman literary and philosophical traditions, while the copying and commentary activities of monastic scholars created new intellectual syntheses that combined classical learning with Christian theology and contemporary practical knowledge. The transformation of Carolingian palace schools into cathedral schools and emerging university centres reflected the decentralisation of educational authority that accompanied broader political fragmentation, as regional ecclesiastical centres assumed responsibility for maintaining educational institutions that had previously operated under direct imperial patronage. The cathedral school at Chartres emerged as a particularly important centre of learning during the 11th and 12th centuries, where scholars like Fulbert of Chartres developed innovative approaches to theological education that combined rigorous textual analysis with practical training for ecclesiastical administration. The school's curriculum emphasised both classical literary studies and contemporary theological debates, preparing graduates for leadership positions within the church hierarchy while maintaining intellectual connections with other educational centres throughout Europe. The legal legacy of Carolingian legislation, embodied primarily in the extensive collection of capitularies issued by Charlemagne and his successors, provided foundational principles for medieval European jurisprudence that influenced legal development throughout the feudal period and beyond. The Capitula de Villes, which established comprehensive regulations for the management of royal estates, continued to serve as a model for agricultural administration long after the dissolution of centralized Carolingian authority. While its detailed provisions regarding crop rotation, animal husbandry, and craft production influenced manorial organization throughout medieval Europe. The legal principles embedded in these regulations, particularly their emphasis on written documentation and systematic record-keeping, established precedents for administrative efficiency that would be adopted by feudal lords seeking to maximize revenues from their territorial holdings. The ecclesiastical legislation contained within Carolingian capitularies created institutional frameworks for church-state cooperation that survived the political fragmentation of the empire, while providing models for religious reform throughout the medieval period. The Admonitio Generalis of 789, which established comprehensive standards for clerical education and monastic discipline, continued to influence ecclesiastical legislation throughout Europe as regional church councils adapted its provisions to local conditions and contemporary challenges. The capitulary's emphasis on uniform liturgical practices and standardized religious observances created foundations for Catholic unity that transcended political boundaries while providing mechanisms for cultural transmission that preserved Christian traditions despite periodic political upheavals. The judicial procedures established through Carolingian legislation influenced the development of medieval legal systems by providing models for court organization, evidence evaluation, and dispute resolution that could be adapted to feudal political structures. The emphasis on written documentation and witness testimony that characterized Carolingian legal practice established precedents for procedural regularity that distinguished medieval European law from contemporary legal traditions in other regions. The integration of Roman legal principles with Germanic customary law that occurred within Carolingian courts created hybrid legal systems that provided frameworks for resolving the complex jurisdictional disputes that characterized feudal society while maintaining connections with classical legal traditions. The geographical foundations established through Carolingian territorial organization created lasting frameworks for European political development that would influence the emergence of national monarchies throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The linguistic boundaries that had emerged during the Treaty of Verdun negotiations reflected underlying cultural divisions that would eventually crystallize into distinct national identities, as the Romance-speaking populations of West Francia developed political and cultural institutions that differed markedly from those of their Germanic neighbours in East Francia. The administrative divisions created by Carolingian territorial arrangements provided organizational frameworks that regional authorities could adapt to their particular needs, while maintaining sufficient institutional continuity to facilitate communication and cooperation across political boundaries. The kingdom that emerged from West Francia under Capetian leadership retained essential characteristics of Carolingian administrative organization, while adapting these institutions to the realities of feudal governance that emphasized personal relationships over bureaucratic hierarchy. The royal domain, centered on Paris and the Ile-de-France, provided the Capetian monarchs with a territorial base that enabled them to exercise effective authority over their immediate surroundings, while gradually extending their influence over nominally subordinate feudal principalities through strategic marriages, military campaigns, and diplomatic negotiations. The preservation of Carolingian legal traditions within royal courts provided institutional continuity that facilitated the eventual restoration of centralized authority under later medieval monarchs who could claim legitimacy through their connection with both Carolingian precedents and feudal relationships. The eastern territories that had formed the core of East Francia evolved into the Holy Roman Empire under Ottonian leadership, preserving Carolingian imperial ideology while adapting these concepts to the realities of German political organization based on tribal duchies and regional autonomy. The Saxon emperor's success in reviving imperial authority reflected their ability to combine effective military leadership, with sophisticated understanding of the federal arrangements that had emerged from Carolingian territorial fragmentation. The preservation of Carolingian administrative procedures within imperial chancelleries ensured institutional continuity that enabled the Holy Roman Empire to function as an effective political organisation despite the challenges posed by its vast territorial extent and ethnic diversity. The Italian peninsula's political development reflected the complex interaction between Carolingian legal traditions, Byzantine administrative practices, and emerging municipal institutions that would eventually create the distinctive city-state system that characterized medieval Italian politics. The preservation of Carolingian legal codes within Italian courts provided frameworks for resolving disputes between different ethnic and cultural communities while facilitating commercial relationships that connected Italian markets with Northern European trading networks. The adaptation of Carolingian administrative procedures to Italian urban environments created hybrid institutional arrangements that combined royal authority with local autonomy in ways that enabled Italian cities to maintain their independence while acknowledging imperial supremacy. The cultural foundations laid through Carolingian educational and religious reforms created shared intellectual traditions that transcended political boundaries while providing mechanisms for cultural transmission that preserved classical learning and Christian theology throughout the period of political fragmentation. The standardization of liturgical practices achieved through Carolingian religious legislation created foundations for Catholic unity that enabled the medieval church to function as an international institution despite the absence of effective political coordination between different kingdoms and principalities. The preservation of classical texts within monastic libraries ensured that medieval scholars retained access to Roman literary and philosophical traditions while creating opportunities for new intellectual syntheses that would influence European cultural development throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. The Carolingian Empire's dissolution in the late 9th and early 10th centuries marked not an endpoint but a transformation that fundamentally reshaped European civilization, creating institutional and cultural frameworks that would define medieval society for centuries. The Empire's most profound contribution lay in its role as a crucial bridge between the classical Roman world and the emerging medieval order, preserving essential elements of Roman administrative practice, legal tradition, and intellectual culture while adapting these inheritances to the realities of post-imperial Germanic society. This synthesis occurred not through conscious design but through the practical necessities of governing diverse populations across vast territories that required both the organizational sophistication of Roman imperial administration and the personal loyalty relationships that characterized Germanic political culture. The administrative innovations developed during Charlemagne's reign established precedents for governmental organization that transcended the empire's political boundaries, influencing the development of royal administration throughout medieval Europe. The Missi Dominici system, despite its eventual transformation into hereditary feudal relationships, demonstrated the possibility of systematic oversight across vast territories through appointed commissioners who answered directly to central authority. This concept of royal agents operating independently of local power structures provided models that would be revived by later medieval monarchs seeking to reassert central control over fragmented territories, from the Capetian bailli in France to the Angevin sheriffs in England. The Carolingian chancellery's development of standardized administrative procedures created institutional frameworks that survived the empire's political fragmentation, while providing continuity between Roman bureaucratic traditions and medieval governmental practice. The preservation of written records, systematic documentation of legal decisions, and standardized formats for royal correspondence established administrative cultures within regional courts that maintained these practices long after centralized Carolingian authority had disappeared. The influence of these procedures extended beyond the former Carolingian territories through diplomatic contacts, ecclesiastical networks, and the movement of trained administrators who carried their expertise to emerging kingdoms throughout Europe. The legal synthesis achieved through Carolingian legislation represented one of the empire's most enduring contributions to European civilization, creating hybrid legal systems that combined Roman jurisprudential principles with Germanic customary law in ways that provided frameworks for medieval legal development. The capitularies issued by Charlemagne and his successors established precedents for royal legislation that influenced the development of royal law throughout medieval Europe, while their integration of ecclesiastical and secular legal traditions created models for the complex jurisdictional arrangements that characterized medieval society. The Carolingian emphasis on written law and procedural regularity distinguished European legal development from contemporary legal traditions in other regions, while providing foundations for the sophisticated legal systems that would emerge during the later medieval period. The establishment of the Holy Roman Empire as a direct successor to Carolingian imperial authority created one of medieval Europe's most significant political institutions, demonstrating both the enduring appeal of universal Christian monarchy and the practical challenges involved in governing diverse populations across vast territories. Otto-Thur's revival of imperial dignity in 962 consciously evoked Carolingian precedents, while adapting imperial ideology to contemporary political realities that required accommodation with regional autonomy and ecclesiastical independence. The complex relationship between imperial authority and papal supremacy that emerged from this arrangement established patterns of church-state interaction that would influence European political development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The Holy Roman Empire's federal structure, based on the stem duchies that had emerged during the dissolution of East Frankish central authority, represented a sophisticated adaptation of Carolingian administrative principles to German political realities that emphasized tribal identity and regional autonomy. The empire's ability to function effectively despite its decentralized structure demonstrated the continuing relevance of Carolingian governmental concepts, while illustrating the flexibility required for successful medieval statecraft. The imperial chancellery's preservation of Carolingian administrative procedures ensured institutional continuity that enabled the Holy Roman Empire to maintain diplomatic relationships and coordinate military campaigns across its vast territories throughout the medieval period. The relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority that developed during the Carolingian period established fundamental principles for medieval political theory that would influence European governance throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Charlemagne's assumption of responsibility for religious reform and ecclesiastical administration created precedents for royal involvement in church affairs that would generate centuries of conflict and negotiation between temporal and spiritual authorities. The concept of Christian kingship that emerged from Carolingian political theory invested secular authority with religious significance while creating expectations for moral leadership that would influence medieval concepts of legitimate governance. The papal alliance that had legitimized Carolingian rule established institutional frameworks for church-state cooperation that survived the empire's political fragmentation, while providing models for similar arrangements throughout medieval Europe. The mutual dependence between Carolingian rulers and papal authority demonstrated the advantages of combining secular military power with ecclesiastical legitimacy, creating partnerships that enabled both institutions to achieve objectives that would have been impossible through independent action. The precedents established through these relationships influenced the development of medieval political theory, while providing practical models for managing the complex jurisdictional disputes that characterized medieval society. The cultural and linguistic developments that emerged from Carolingian policies had profound implications for European identity formation that extended far beyond the empire's immediate territorial boundaries. The standardization of Latin as the language of administration, education, and religious observance created a common intellectual culture that transcended political boundaries while facilitating communication between different regions and social groups throughout medieval Europe. The preservation and transmission of classical texts through Carolingian scriptoriums ensured that medieval scholars retained access to Roman literary and philosophical traditions while creating opportunities for new intellectual syntheses that would influence European cultural development throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. The emergence of vernacular literary traditions during the late Carolingian period reflected the empire's role in fostering linguistic development that would eventually contribute to the formation of distinct national identities throughout Europe. The Strasbourg Oaths of 842, with their use of Romance and Germanic vernaculars for official purposes, demonstrated the practical recognition of linguistic diversity that would eventually crystallize into separate cultural and political identities. The preservation of these linguistic developments within written records created foundations for vernacular literary traditions that would flourish throughout the medieval period while maintaining connections with the Latin intellectual culture that had been standardized through Carolingian educational reforms. The architectural and artistic achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance established aesthetic standards and technical capabilities that would influence European cultural development throughout the medieval period. The Palatine Chapel at Aachen, with its innovative combination of Byzantine, Roman and Germanic design elements, created architectural precedents that would be adapted and modified throughout medieval Europe, while demonstrating the cultural sophistication that could be achieved through the synthesis of different artistic traditions. The technical innovations developed during Carolingian building projects, including advanced stone-cutting techniques, complex vaulting systems, and sophisticated engineering solutions, provided foundations for the architectural achievements of the Romanesque and Gothic periods. The monastic reform movement promoted through Carolingian religious legislation created institutional frameworks for preserving and transmitting classical learning while adapting these intellectual traditions to contemporary Christian purposes. The standardization of the rule of St. Benedict throughout Carolingian territories established uniform practices for monastic life that would influence religious development throughout medieval Europe while creating networks of religious houses that facilitated cultural transmission across political boundaries. The educational activities conducted within these monastic communities preserved essential elements of classical learning while creating new intellectual syntheses that would provide foundations for medieval scholasticism and university education. Modern historiographical debates about the extent of Carolingian achievements and their significance in the broader context of European development reflect the complexity of assessing historical transformations that occurred over extended periods and influenced multiple aspects of civilization simultaneously. Traditional interpretations that emphasize the Carolingian Renaissance as a conscious revival of classical learning have been challenged by scholars who argue that these developments represented practical adaptations to contemporary needs, rather than deliberate attempts to recreate Roman imperial culture. The debate reflects broader questions about the relationship between cultural continuity and historical change that continue to influence scholarly understanding of medieval European development. The assessment of Carolingian military achievements presents similar interpretative challenges, as scholars debate whether the empire's territorial expansion represented genuine conquest and integration or merely temporary political arrangements that collapsed once central authority weakened. The empire's success in defending Christian territories against external threats, particularly the Muslim expansion into Europe and the pagan Slavic and Magyar incursions, clearly demonstrated the effectiveness of Carolingian military organization while establishing precedents for coordinated Christian resistance to external enemies. However, the sustainability of these achievements depended on maintaining the complex political and military arrangements that had enabled initial success, arrangements that proved vulnerable to the succession disputes and administrative challenges that characterized the later Carolingian period. The economic impact of Carolingian policies remains a subject of scholarly debate, with historians disagreeing about the extent to which imperial legislation and administrative reforms contributed to the commercial revival that characterized the 8th and 9th centuries. The standardization of weights, measures and currency systems clearly facilitated interregional trade while reducing transaction costs that had previously limited commercial development. But the relationship between these administrative improvements and broader economic trends remains unclear. The empire's role in protecting trade routes and maintaining political stability certainly contributed to commercial growth, though the extent to which Carolingian policies directly caused economic expansion, rather than simply providing favourable conditions for developments that would have occurred anyway, continues to generate scholarly discussion. The assessment of Carolingian contributions to European political development must acknowledge both the empire's remarkable achievements and its ultimate inability to create lasting institutional arrangements that could survive the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast territories without modern communication and transportation systems. The empire's success in adapting Roman administrative principles to Germanic political traditions created governmental innovations that would influence European political development for centuries, while its failure to resolve fundamental tensions between central authority and regional autonomy demonstrated the limitations of medieval statecraft when confronted by the practical challenges of governing complex societies. The Carolingian Empire's historical significance lies not in its temporary political unity, but in its lasting contributions to European institutional development, cultural transmission, and identity formation. The empire's role in preserving classical learning, standardizing religious practices, and creating administrative frameworks provided foundations for medieval European civilization that would survive and flourish long after the political structures that created them had disappeared. The synthesis of Roman, Germanic, and Christian traditions, achieved during the Carolingian period, established cultural patterns that would define European civilization throughout the medieval period, while providing intellectual and institutional resources that would enable the remarkable achievements of the later medieval and Renaissance periods. The empire's ultimate legacy lies in its demonstration that European civilization could maintain continuity with classical traditions while adapting to contemporary realities through creative synthesis and institutional innovation. The Carolingian achievement established precedents for cultural preservation and transmission that would enable European civilization to survive and flourish despite periodic political fragmentation and external challenges, creating foundations for the remarkable intellectual, artistic, and political achievements that would characterize European development throughout the medieval and early modern periods. In this broader historical context, the Carolingian Empire represents not merely a transitional phase between classical and medieval civilization, but a crucial period of creative synthesis that established enduring patterns for European cultural and political development.